The clock at St. George's had just struck one. The gaslight in the little parlour on Cardigan Place burned low and blue. Harriet Dove lay on the horsehair sofa, her lips grey, her fingers curled tight around a crust of bread she had not eaten. The room smelled of vinegar and burnt sugar, and of something sharper underneath, something she could not name. Her husband knelt beside her, with a cup of warm brandy and water. His hand shook, and a little of it spilled onto her sleeve. He did not wipe it away. Outside, a horse passed on the cobbles, slow and tired. Somewhere in Leeds, a chapel bell answered the hour, and on the mantel, folded small behind the tea caddy, lay a paper the wizard had given him, and it was already too late. The quiet before the fall. Good evening. Welcome back to the Bedside Historian. Come in and close the door behind you. Wherever you are listening from tonight, a small room in a large city, a cottage on a quiet lane, a bed by a window where the rain is falling, I am glad you are here. Tell me, in your own mind, what hour it is on your side of the night. Late, I hope. Late enough that the streets are empty, and the light on your ceiling has gone soft, and the day you had is finally over. Before we begin, I would ask one small kindness. If you have not yet subscribed to the channel, please do. And if the little heart under the video is not yet lit, tap it now. It does help. It brings more of these long, slow histories to more people who need them, and it costs you nothing but a moment. Now, let the world grow small. Let it be only this room, and my voice, and a single street in the north of England, 170 years ago, in the spring of 1856. We are going to Leeds. Not the Leeds of the picture books, not the great town hall with its lions, for that hall was not yet built. The Leeds we are walking into is a wool town, a mill town, a smoke town. It sits in a bowl of hills, and the hills hold the smoke in over its roofs, like a lid on a cooking pot. In the mornings the air is thick enough to taste. Housewives on the outer streets peg their washing out and take it in again grey. Chimneys rise out of every yard, from the great mill stacks along the River Aire down to the little back-to-back kitchens where a woman is boiling a pan of tripe for her husband's dinner. Everything here is made and unmade by fire and by water. Wool comes in on the carts from the moors. Cloth goes out on the trains to London, to Liverpool, and, from Liverpool, to the far ends of the world. If you had walked into Leeds on an April morning that year, you would have smelled the tanning pits and the boiling soap. You would have heard the clatter of 1,000 looms through the walls of the mills, a sound like heavy rain on a metal roof, and never stopping. Women passed in shawls, carrying bread in their aprons. Boys ran errands with wooden clogs on their feet. There were a great many horses, tired, patient, standing at the curb. A pound of best butter cost about 1 shilling. A quart of milk was 2p. A working man in a mill earned perhaps 18 shillings a week, if he was skilled and lucky. A dressmaker's girl earned 4. We are not going into the mills. We are going up, and a little west, to a street called Cardigan Place. It is a short row of neat brick houses, respectable rather than rich, the kind of street a young couple takes when they have some money behind them and a name to protect. The doors are painted. Each front has a scraped stone step. In the little gardens, wallflowers are just coming into bloom. It is that week of April when the trees in the yards have leaves the size of a mouse's ear, and the light stays a little longer each night. At number 1, or perhaps 2, the papers of the day are not quite settled on the number, and the house is long gone now under later building. Live William Dove, aged 29, and his wife Harriet, aged 28. They have been married 4 winters. They have no children, and it is not clear there was ever any hope of one. What the record does say, in more than one hand, is that Harriet is not well. She has been not well for a long time. The doctor calls it hysteria. Her family, more gently, call it her nerves. She takes fits, sometimes in the parlour, sometimes on the stairs, sometimes at the chapel when the preacher's voice rises too suddenly. She has taken them since she was a girl. Now, before we go inside, let me tell you something about William, so that we know who we are meeting at the door. He is a farmer's son. His father, Christopher Dove, has land at a place called High Farm, in the parish of Osmanthorpe, on the eastern edge of the town. There are cows there, and a small dairy, and a woman who comes in to help with the churning. Christopher Dove is a Methodist and a hard man in the old sense, plain in his dress, strict at his table, sparing with a smile. He wanted a strong son. What he was given was William. And whether William was born strange or made strange, no one in this story ever quite agrees. The neighbours in Osmanthorpe will tell you, if you sit long enough with them, that the boy was odd from the cradle. The doctors, later, will use longer words. But we are not there yet. For now, on this April morning in 1856, William is a young man of some means, married, in good clothes, walking down Cardigan Place with his hands in his coat pockets, looking as respectable as any other husband on the street. He is short, a little heavy through the chest, with a round face and a pale, unhappy mouth. His hair is thinning already. His eyes, more than one witness will say, do not quite meet yours. They slide away. You would not, at first, notice anything wrong. That is the thing about a house on the edge of respectability. It does not shout. It keeps its curtains drawn, and its front step scrubbed, and its trouble on the inside. Come, let us go up the step. The door opens onto a narrow hall. There is a floor cloth in a plain check pattern, brown and cream, worn thin by the coal scuttle. On the wall, a print of a moorland scene, and beneath it a small table where the letters are put. The parlour is on the right, the kitchen is at the back. Upstairs there is a bedroom for the master and mistress, a smaller room used for storage, and, up a second narrow stair, an attic where the servant girl sleeps under the slates. The house is not large, perhaps 5 yards across the front, but it is enough for 2 people and their girl, and it is enough for their secrets. The girl is Elizabeth Fisher. She is not yet 20. She came into service here from a village called Bramham, some miles out on the York Road, where her mother sent her because there was one mouth too many at home, and because the Doves paid, she was promised, £4 a year and her keep. Elizabeth is thin, she has red hands from the range, and the beginnings of a stoop from carrying coal. She rises at 5:30 in the morning to lay the parlour fire and wash the front step, and she does not lie down again until the master's boots come off at 10 or 5:30. On a Sunday afternoon, in her few hours to herself, she walks out to the graveyard at St. Peter's and reads the names on the stones, because she cannot afford to walk further, and because it is the only place near the house that is peaceful. She is watching all of this, though she does not know yet what she is watching. Try to remember her, if you can. Elizabeth Fisher, the girl from Bramham with the red hands. Her name will matter later. The mistress, Harriet, is in the parlour this morning, sat by the little coal fire, with a shawl over her knees. She has one of her thin days. Her hair is up, but not neatly. Her hands lie in her lap, and the fingers move by themselves, twisting the corner of the shawl into a point and letting it fall. She is not reading. There is a Bible on the little table beside her, and a copy of the Leeds Mercury, and a plate with the crust of a piece of dry toast on it. She has eaten only the crust. The middle of the slice lies untouched. She has been like this, on and off, for days now, but she has been like it, in truth, on and off, for years. The record does not tell us what Harriet was like when she was well. The people who spoke of her, and later wrote about her, only ever met her when she was ill. She is easy to lose, in this story, because everyone around her is louder, the husband, the doctors, the wizard, the lawyers, the chaplain. And she is only ever the woman on the sofa, the woman on the stairs, the woman who took the tea and then began to shake. But she was a real person. She had a girlhood, and she had opinions, and she had a first husband before William, a man called Jenkins who died young. Somewhere in her, before the fits, there was a young woman who liked hymns and liked new bonnets and liked being called Mrs. Jenkins, because it was the first grown name she had ever owned. Try to hold on to her. She will need you. Her family did not want the marriage to William Dove. That much is very clear. Her father, a plain Methodist tradesman, saw the young farmer's son and did not like what he saw. He did not like the way William looked at the collection plate. He did not like the way William laughed once, in the vestry, at a piece of news that was not funny. He did not like the way William had been sent home from 3 separate places of work before he was 21. But Harriet was a widow, and she was frail, and her father was tired, and William had a bit of money coming through his father, and in the end the wedding was allowed. It was in the winter of 1852, at Brunswick Chapel, under a low grey Leeds sky. The record does not tell us if it was raining that morning. It usually is in Leeds at the end of the year. They took the house on Cardigan Place. They set up the little parlour with the horsehair sofa and the coal fire and the print on the wall. They took Elizabeth in to help. From the outside, the young couple looked settled. They went to chapel. William made small talk with the deacons after the service. Harriet nodded and did not speak much, and people put that down to her weak nerves. On a Sunday afternoon, you might have passed them coming home along the pavement, arm in arm, and thought nothing more of them than of any other pair. And yet the marriage was already, by that spring of 1856, ill. It is not always possible to say how a marriage becomes ill. The record has bruises on Harriet, seen by the doctor, and later spoken of in court. But the record does not tell us what was said in the bedroom, and it does not tell us who was cruel first. It tells us that William drank in the kitchen after dark. It tells us that Harriet, on more than one night, took her pillow down to the servant's little room in the attic and slept there instead of in her own bed. It tells us that the door to the master bedroom was often locked, and that when it was locked, no one, not the doctor and not the maid, was sure who was on which side of it. I have stood, once, on the piece of Leeds where Cardigan Place used to be. It is not there any more. It is a bit of road, and some later building, and the wind goes through it in a plain, ordinary way. Nothing on the pavement remembers the house at all. That is often how it is with the streets where these stories happen. You go, and you find that history has left no mark, and you have to bring the mark with you. But on this April morning we are speaking of, the house is still there. The fire is lit. The girl is on her knees at the range, scraping black off the bottom of a pan with a fistful of ash. The mistress is on the sofa, twisting the corner of her shawl. The master is out. He has walked down into the town. He has told his wife, when she asked, that he is going to the chemist for a bottle of something for her fits. That is true, as far as it goes. Mr. Morley, the surgeon, who lives across the way, has an apprentice at the shop, and the apprentice will sell William a small phial of a thing to help her sleep. But William, this morning, is also going somewhere else. He is going down a passage off Boar Lane, in the middle of the town, to a small room above a shop where a man called Henry Harrison sits behind a table with a set of playing cards and a teacup and a black book. William has been there before. He will go there many more times before the summer is out. The door of that room is not the door of a chemist, and the paper that William will bring home from it, folded very small in his coat pocket, is not a paper for any illness of the body. For now, though, we sit here, in the parlour on Cardigan Place. The coal shifts in the grate. Elizabeth comes in with a fresh cup and sets it at Harriet's elbow. Harriet does not look up. Outside, on the cobbles, a horse passes, slow and tired, and a chapel bell strikes the hour, somewhere over the roofs of the town. The gaslight has not yet been lit. The room is soft and warm, and, from the pavement, entirely ordinary. We will stay here, in this hush, a little longer. It is the last hush the house on Cardigan Place will have. A son of the meeting house. We must leave Cardigan Place for a while now. Leave the parlour with the coal fire, and the horsehair sofa, and the girl at the range. Leave Harriet twisting the corner of her shawl. We will come back to that room, I promise you. But before we can understand what William Dove is walking into town to fetch this morning, we have to understand where William Dove came from. And that means going out of Leeds altogether, east along the York Road, 3 miles or so, to a piece of high ground where the wind never quite stops, and a working farm that belonged to his father. Osmondthorpe, in the 1820s and 30s, was hardly a village at all. It was a scatter of holdings, a lane, a chapel, a public house, and a great deal of grazing land turning gently downhill toward the smoke of the town. On a fine morning you could see the chimneys of Leeds from the top field, standing up out of the haze like a row of dark thumbs. On a wet morning you could not see the end of your own yard. Christopher Dove's farm sat about halfway between the lane and the beck. It had a stone house, a byre for the cows, a barn for the hay, a pigsty, and a walled kitchen garden with rhubarb and turnips, and a row of black currants along the north side. It was, in the language of the parish, a good middle sort of place. Not gentry, not poor, a farm that could feed the family and pay a man or two beside. William was born there in the December of 1826. The parish register at Whitkirk records the baptism a few weeks later, in a hand that has faded to the colour of weak tea. His mother was called Mary. She had been married to Christopher some years by then, and there were older children in the house already, brothers and sisters who would grow up steady and useful and unremarkable. William, from the beginning, was none of those three things. I want to be careful here, because it would be easy to make a monster of the child and then pretend that was an explanation. It is not an explanation. Plenty of children were odd in Osmondthorpe, and grew up to keep dairies and mind their tempers. But the record does say certain things, and the record is what we have. So let me tell you what the people who lived alongside him said, and let you make your own weather of it. Mary Dove, his mother, was the one who saw the earliest signs. She never wrote a memoir. Women on farms outside Leeds in the 1830s did not, as a rule, write memoirs. What we have from her is second-hand, remarks she made to her husband and to the doctor, and later, when the trial came, remarks that her surviving relations remembered and repeated on oath. She said the baby did not cry in the ordinary way. She said he would stare at a candle for longer than seemed right. She said, when he was 2 or 3, that she found him one afternoon in the yard with a hen between his knees, holding its head under his boot with a kind of interest that was not the interest of a farmer's child. She took the hen away. She did not scold him, because she was not sure, in that moment, what to scold him for. She only carried the bird back to the coop and stood there for a long time with her hand on the wall. That is the sort of thing his mother said, in later years, when she could bring herself to say anything. I would not put too much weight on any one of them. Every mother of a difficult child, looking back, finds signs in the cradle that were not there at the time. But she said them, and she said them more than once, and she said them to people who had no reason to invent for her. Christopher Dove, the father, saw a different thing. He saw a son who would not take a hiding well. There is nothing surprising in itself, in a Methodist farmer of that generation, using a strap on a boy for lighting a fire in the wrong place, or for tormenting a lamb, or for telling a lie at the dinner table. That was the discipline of the age, and it was thought a kindness. What surprised Christopher, and what he spoke of later to more than one neighbour, was that William did not weep at the strap. He took it, he turned his face to the wall, and after, in the yard, he would go back and do the same thing again, sometimes within the hour. It was not defiance in the ordinary sense. It was more as though the punishment and the deed had come loose from one another in his mind, and neither one now touched the other. There were fires. That is the thing the neighbours remembered most often when they were asked. A boy of 6 or 7, William was found more than once with a bundle of dry straw and a lucifer match, in a corner of the byre or under the eaves of the barn where the hay was stacked. Farm children played with fire, that was known, but they played with it out in the open, in the way children play with anything dangerous, half proud and half afraid. William did not play with it in the open. He took it into places where it could catch. When the straw was pulled out from under his hand and the match knocked away, he would look at the man who had done it, not with fear and not with sorrow, but with a small flat curiosity, as though he wanted to see what the man would do next. Once, and this is well attested, he was found holding the tail of a barn cat in the flame of a candle. The cat was screaming, and William was not. A farmhand called Jonas, who had come in for a jug of milk, took the candle from him and cuffed him across the head. William dropped the cat and stood there a moment, considering Jonas. Then he laughed. It was, Jonas said, a laugh that came at the wrong moment, and it stayed with him for years. Come back with me, for a breath, to the parlour on Cardigan Place, to Harriet, twisting the corner of her shawl, because you should hold in your mind, as we go through this, that the man who knelt beside her horsehair sofa this morning, with a cup of brandy and water, was the same boy in the barn with the candle. Not a different man. The same one, grown up, in a coat, in a marriage, in a house on a scraped stone step. The neighbours in Osmondthorpe, if you had asked them in the year we are now sitting in, could have named you the year, the field, the day. They had not forgotten. Now, let us go back out to the farm. Mary tried, in her way, to shield him. She fed him herself longer than the others. She would take him out with her into the kitchen garden and set him to weeding the rhubarb, because it was work he could do alone, and it kept him from the animals. She sat him beside her on the settle in the evenings and read him verses from the book of Proverbs, verses about the fear of the Lord, and about the rod, and about the woman whose price was above rubies. He listened. He remembered whole passages by rote. He could, when a visitor called, stand up in the parlour and recite a chapter of Isaiah in a clear voice, and the visitor would say afterwards to Mary that she had a very promising boy, and Mary would smile and say thank you, and inside herself she would be very tired. It is here, I think, that a person tips one way or another. A different mother, a different father, a different chapel might have gone easier on him, or harder, or asked for help sooner. But the help that was available in Osmondthorpe in the 1830s was not the help we would send for now. There was no word for what was wrong with William. The doctors of Leeds, if they were called, might have spoken of a weakness of the moral faculty, or of a hereditary taint, or of the humours being out of balance. They would have prescribed cold baths and blistering, and, in the worst cases, a course of leeches behind the ear. None of that was going to touch the boy in the barn. So Mary read him Proverbs, and Christopher took the strap to him, and the neighbours said what neighbours say, and the years went on. He was schooled, after a fashion, at a small day school run by a widow in the next village. The widow taught reading and simple arithmetic to about a dozen children in her front room for a penny a week. William learned to read and write there without much trouble. He was, by all accounts, a quick boy at his letters. The widow, when she was asked years later, said only that he had been a strange child, that he had once tried to set fire to her cat, and that she had asked his father to take him away after the second winter. She was not the last person to ask that. She was in fact only the first of many. There is a story from those years that I have thought about more than most, and I will give it to you, because it seems to me to sit closer to the truth of William than any of the fires. He was perhaps 10. His mother had sent him down to the beck with a wooden bucket to fetch water for the scullery, because the well pump had gone dry in a hot spell of weather. William did not come back for a long time. When Mary went to look for him, she found him sitting on the bank of the beck with the empty bucket beside him. He was watching a beetle. The beetle was walking in a slow circle on the flat of a stone. William had put a ring of pebbles around it, so that whenever the beetle came to the edge of the stone, it met a pebble and turned. Mary asked him what he was doing. William said, without looking up, that he was seeing how many times it would go round before it stopped. Mary asked him why. William said he did not know. She stood there a while, and then she took the bucket, and she walked down to the beck herself, and she filled it, and she carried it home. William followed her, some paces behind, whistling. 2 things about that story. First, it is not a monstrous story. There is no blood in it, no fire, no dead animal. A great many boys have done worse to a great many beetles. Second, it is exactly the sort of story that Mary Dove would have forgotten by nightfall, had she not, later in her life, been asked to sit down in a lawyer's office and remember every peculiar thing her son had ever done. What we have of William's boyhood, we have because a trial required it. There will have been many hours, many days, many whole seasons in which he was, so far as anyone could see, an ordinary boy on an ordinary farm, and no one wrote down that he had been ordinary, because there was nothing to write. Try to hold on to that too. It is easy, in a story of this shape, to make the boy nothing but a set of warnings. By the time William was 13, however, Christopher had made up his mind that the farm was no place for him. 2 ricks had gone up in the previous year, one of them belonging to a neighbour, and although nothing was ever proved, Christopher had his own thoughts, and he did not want to have them for another summer. Mary wept in the kitchen when the decision was made, because she had always feared that if William went out from under her hand into the world of other men, the world of other men would use him hard, and she was not wrong. But Christopher was firm. The boy would be sent out to be broken into a useful man. He would be placed with steady farmers, and later, if a farm would not hold him, with a tradesman. He would be given the discipline of a master's roof and the company of working men, and he would come back either mended or not at all. You have to picture that decision in the kitchen of the stone house at Osmondthorpe, on some evening in the autumn of 1840, the lamp on the table, the Bible on the shelf above the fire, Mary at one end of the table, with her hands folded in her apron, Christopher at the other, in his working coat, his beard already grey at the sides. William would have been out in the yard, or up in the loft where he slept, or somewhere along the lane, and they would have spoken of him in the low tones people use in a farmhouse when they are deciding a child's life without the child in the room. Christopher said what he had to say. Mary did not argue. She only asked him, please, to place the boy first with someone kind, so that the first hand on him would not be a hard one. Christopher said he would try. Whether he did try, and how kind the first hand really was, we cannot know from the record. The name of the first master is written down in one place, misspelled in another, and lost altogether in a third. What we do know is that the arrangement did not last. Within months, William was back at the farmhouse door, with his bundle over his shoulder and a letter in his hand, explaining, in careful language, that the boy would not do, and that was only the first of them. Over the next several years, William Dove would be sent out to farmers, to a tradesman in the town, to a chemist for a stretch, to more than one household who took him on out of charity to his father and regretted it before the season turned. Each in turn would send him back. Some sent him back for the fires, some for the animals, some for the laugh that came at the wrong moment. One, at least, is remembered to have sent him back for a thing he did with a hot poker that no one afterwards would put in writing. Christopher would take him in each time and stand him in the yard and speak to him and put him to work about the farm for a few weeks and then find another placing and send him out again. Mary would pack his bundle and mend his shirt and pray. In the chapel on the Sunday before each new placement, she would ask the preacher to hold her son in his prayers. The preacher, whose name was Barker, and who was a decent man, always did. But the preacher's prayers, like his mother's reading of Proverbs, and like his father's strap, did not touch him where he needed to be touched. William would climb up on the cart on the Monday morning, in his mended shirt and his best boots, and lift a hand to his mother as the wheels turned. He would ride out along the lane toward Leeds, and beyond Leeds, to the next house that had said it would try. The wind on that top field never quite stopped. It did not stop for him, the boy who was sent away. The first placement, in the record we have, was with a farmer at Barwick in Elmet, a few miles east of Leeds along the York Road. His name was Ellis. He kept a flock of sheep and a small dairy of 6 cows, and he had asked around the parish that autumn for a lad who could turn his hand to the yard. Christopher Dove had heard of him at the corn market and spoken to him there over a mug of ale. A price was set. William would have his food and his bed, and 1 shilling a week in his hand on a Sunday, and Ellis would send him back to chapel on the last Sunday of every month, so that his mother could see he had a face and a voice still. William went out to Barwick in the November of 1840. It was cold on the York Road that morning, or so I imagine, though the record does not name the weather. Mary put a woolen scarf around his neck at the yard gate and did not weep. Christopher shook his hand. William climbed up beside the carter and did not look back. He was 13 years old, and he was already almost as tall as his mother. Ellis kept him 10 weeks. We do not know, in the exact way, what was done in those 10 weeks. Ellis was not a man for letters. What survives is a note in his own hand, folded once, kept afterwards by Christopher, and produced many years later in a lawyer's office at York. The note says only that the boy would not do, and that he was sending him home before Christmas, and that he wished the family well in the finding of another place for him. Between the lines of that note there is a great deal. One of the ewes was found in the yard one morning with a piece of tin drawn across its throat. The dog would not go near William once the first week was out. A neighbour's stack was scorched, though not fired, on a night when everyone else in the house had been asleep. Ellis, in his note, said none of this. He said only that the boy would not do. That is the sentence, in one form or another, that every letter home about William Dove would come to say. He was home 3 days before Christmas. Mary took the scarf off his neck and hung it on its peg by the door. She fed him a plate of hot broth in the kitchen and asked him no questions. Christopher, when he came in from the byre in the last hour of the light, stood in the doorway a while and looked at his son across the length of the table. Then he went into the parlour and did not speak of it that night. He waited until after the New Year, and then he went out again to the market, and he found the next man. The next man was a farmer called Roberts, at a place outside Tadcaster, further along the same eastern road. Roberts was harder than Ellis had been. He had a reputation in the district for taking on lads that others would not, and for making men of them by the method of long hours and short suppers. Christopher hoped, I think, that a firm hand would do what a milder one had not. It is a hope many fathers have had, and it is very seldom rewarded. We know a little more of William at Roberts's than we do of him at Ellis's, because Roberts had a wife, and his wife had a sister, and the sister was one of the people the lawyers found years later when they were building a picture of the boy for the trial. She said William had come to them thin in the first week, and had grown no less thin in the weeks that followed. He worked when he was watched. He stopped when he was not. He would sit on the back step in the middle of the afternoon with a bit of straw in his hand, plaiting it and unplaiting it, and staring at the pig in its pen across the yard, until Roberts came out and cuffed him back to the byre. He did not seem to mind being cuffed. That was the thing that stayed with the sister, more than anything else. He did not seem to mind. We must go on a moment past Roberts's yard, and out through the lane behind the pigsty, and up onto a piece of low ground where the wind came off the York plain. Because it was there, and not in the yard, that the first true trouble came. A drover found a young dog dead by the wall one evening, in the early spring of 1841, hung by its lead from a piece of iron in the stones. The lead was Roberts's, the dog was Roberts's. The knot had been well tied. Roberts asked William, in front of his wife and his wife's sister, whether he had put the dog there. William said, in the flat voice he used for most things, that he had not. His eyes did not move. Roberts hit him then, hard, across the face, and William, again, did not weep. The sister remembered afterwards that he did not even raise a hand to his cheek. He only turned his head a little and waited, as if to see whether there was another blow coming, and when there was not, he went out into the yard and drew water for the cows. He was sent home the next morning. Roberts's note has not survived. What we have is a remark of Christopher's, made in the presence of a neighbour some years later, that Roberts had told him plainly it was the dog or the boy, and he could not keep both under his roof. Christopher, at that, had taken his son back into the cart and driven the road to Osmondthorpe in silence. Halfway home, he was said to have pulled up the horse in a lane and stepped down and stood with his hand on the wheel for a long time, looking at nothing. The neighbour who told that story was not there. He had it from a man who had it from another man. But Christopher's silence, in those years, is a thing more than one witness spoke of. He was a talker in chapel and a talker at market. In his own kitchen, after William came home, he was often not. Come back with me, for a breath, to Osmondthorpe, to Mary at the door with the scarf in her hand. Because whatever the story was on the York Road, this was the sight she saw more than once in the years between 1840 and 1845. The cart in the lane, the boy on the box, the bundle across his knees, and no letter in his coat that said anything but that the boy would not do. She would take the scarf. She would take the bundle. She would put the broth on the fire, and she would begin, in her mind, to make the peace with Christopher that would let the next placement be found before the month was out. There were, in all, perhaps 6 or 7 of these placements between the ages of 13 and 18. The record is not complete, and the names do not all survive. Some appear only as initials in a later solicitor's note. One name appears twice under 2 different spellings, and may or may not be the same man. What is clear is the shape of the thing. William would be sent out. William would be sent back. Christopher would try again. Mary would pack and unpack the bundle, and the reasons, when they were given at all, gathered themselves into a heap on the parlour table. Fires, at 3 of them, a pony lamed at a 4th, with something sharp put into the frog of its hoof, a dairymaid at a 5th who would not stay in the same room with him after a Sunday, when he came into the dairy while she was churning, and stood too close and laughed at something she had not said. That laugh again. It followed him from place to place, and it walked into a great many rooms before its master did. There was, somewhere in the middle of those years, an attempt at a different sort of placement altogether. A tradesman in Leeds itself, a man in a small way of business, took William on for a stretch as a shop boy. The tradesman's name was, in one account, Elletson, and in another, something like it. He kept a chandler's on a side street off Brigate. He wanted a lad to sweep out and to run parcels, and to sit behind the counter of an evening when he himself was at his supper. William did those things, and he did them well enough for the first few weeks. He wrote out receipts in a fair hand. He could add a column of pence without error. The tradesman began to think, in his own private way, that here was the placement that might hold. Then, one afternoon, Elletson came back from his dinner to find a customer's little dog shut in the coal-hole behind the shop, and William at the counter, whistling. The dog had been in there some time. It was not dead, but it was frightened, and it had cut its nose on a nail in the darkness. Elletson took the dog out. He asked William why. William said, without turning round, that he had wanted to see how long it would take before someone missed it. Elletson wrote to Christopher that night. William was home again by the end of the week. I have thought more than once about that answer. He wanted to see how long it would take before someone missed it. It is not the answer of a boy who has done a wicked thing in a fit of temper and is trying to hide it. It is the answer of a boy who has done a wicked thing on purpose, to find out an answer to a question. And the question is a question about other people, about how much they see, about what they will do when they notice. It is a very old question, and there are many honest ways to ask it, and William was not asking it in any of them. You see perhaps why the neighbours in Osmonthorpe went quiet when the cart came up the lane with him in it again. Not because they were afraid of a strap or a fire. A strap and a fire were ordinary things, and most farms had known both. It was the flat, patient interest in him that unsettled them. A boy who wants to see. A boy who does not, when he is caught, look sorry, or ashamed, or even afraid. A boy who looks, in that first second before he arranges his face, as though he has been waiting all afternoon for someone to walk in. The record does not tell us what the preacher Barker said to Mary in those years. He was a decent man, and I believe he did his best. He would have prayed for the boy in chapel by name, and he would have prayed with her in her kitchen when she asked. He would have said, most likely, that a hard case sometimes broke the way iron broke, all at once, and that with patience and prayer a soul could come home. Whether he believed it himself, at the end of a long evening, I could not say. Barker's own diaries, if he kept any, have not survived. There is only, in one of the chapel minute books, a note of a collection taken up in the summer of 1843 for the family of Christopher Dove in a time of trouble, and no further account of what the trouble was. By the age of 18, in the winter of 1844, the placements had stopped. No one in the district would take him. Christopher had run out of names. William came back to the farm at Osmonthorpe, and he stayed there, and for a stretch of some years he worked, after a fashion, in his father's byre and his father's fields. He was, by then, a young man. He had put on weight through the chest. The unhappy mouth had settled into its shape. The eyes still slid away. It was in that stretch, back on the farm, that Christopher made one last attempt to find him a use in the world. He would apprentice him to a chemist. There was a Mr. Morley, then a younger man himself, setting up a surgery in Leeds. Christopher paid a premium, and had William entered into his service. William would sweep the shop and roll pills, and in time be taught the mixing of common draughts. It seemed, on paper, a way for a boy with fair handwriting and no fitness for the fields to earn his bread. The apprenticeship did not hold either. It never did. But William was in that shop, on and off, for the better part of a year, and he learned there the names of things he had not known before. He learned that a certain white powder in a certain small drawer could kill a rat as fast as a man could snap his fingers. He learned where the drawer was kept and how it was labelled and who had the key. He learned, most of all, that there were substances in the world that did their work by the mouth and without any mark upon the skin and without any sound louder than a groan. I will not tell you yet what he did with what he learned. It is enough that you know, tonight, that when he walked out of Mr. Morley's shop for the last time as an apprentice, he was not the same young man who had walked in. He had been given a lesson. It was the wrong lesson to give him, but no one in Leeds, in the summer of 1846, had any way of knowing that. He went home to Osmondthorpe. He was 20 years old. He was, by every sensible measure, unmarriageable. His mother had by then made her peace with a life that would have William in the kitchen for the rest of her own, and she cooked for him without complaint, and she read her Bible in the evenings, and she asked God, in the smallest hours of the night, for a mercy she did not name. But William had other ideas. He had begun, in his own way, to go into the town on Sundays. He had begun to walk down the pavement in a good coat, past the doors of the chapels, with his hair combed flat and his boots blacked. He had begun, without saying so to anyone, to look for a wife. The cart in the lane at Osmondthorpe stood empty now, tilted on its shafts against the wall of the byre. The boy was home for good. The next journey he would make would not be east along the York Road behind a carter, but west, into the middle of Leeds, on his own 2 feet, on a Sunday morning, in a good coat, toward the pews of a chapel on North Street, where a young widow in a black bonnet was already sitting with her folded hands and her downcast eyes, and the shape, already, of the illness that would one day carry her name into every newspaper in England. Her name was Harriet Jenkins. She did not yet know that anyone was watching her at all. A bride from the chapel. We have to leave Osmondthorpe now, leave the wind on the top field, and the empty cart tilted against the byre, and the mother at her Bible. We have to go west with him, into the town, on a Sunday morning in the autumn of 1851. William is not quite 25. He is in a black coat that has been brushed twice. He has walked the 3 miles from the farm, and there is mud on the heel of his boot that he stops, halfway down Marsh Lane, to scrape away against a curbstone. I want you to see him doing that, a grown man, on a Sunday, bending down at the roadside to make himself presentable for chapel, because it matters, later, that he could take the trouble. Brunswick Chapel stood on the corner of Brunswick Place, where the town was still spreading northward across what had lately been fields. It was a large Methodist meeting house of pale brick, with a shallow flight of steps and 2 doors set on either side of a plain porch. It could seat something like 1,500 worshippers on a full Sunday, and on this Sunday it was very nearly filled. The men went in at one door and the women at the other. William took his place in a pew near the middle of the men's side, close enough to the pulpit to be seen by the preacher, and far enough back to see the whole of the women's side without turning his head. Whether he had chosen the pew for that reason on his first visit, or on his third, the record does not say. I only know that by the autumn we are now sitting in, he had settled into it as if by long habit, and the elders had begun to nod to him at the door. Across from him, 5 pews forward and 1 to the right, sat a young woman in a black bonnet. She was perhaps 22. Her name was Harriet Jenkins. She was the daughter of a family well known in Leeds Methodism, the Jenkinses of Wortley, comfortable but not grand, who kept a house of their own and a piano in the parlour. Harriet had been married once already. Her first husband had been a tradesman of the town, a decent man, and he had died within a year of the wedding of a disorder the doctors called an inflammation of the chest. She had come back to her mother's house a widow before she was 21, and she had put on the black bonnet, and she had gone on going to chapel, because that is what her mother and her aunts had done, and it was what a Jenkins woman did on a Sunday. She had not, so far as anyone in the family could see, begun yet to look up from her hands. I want to be careful with Harriet here. It is easy, in a story of this shape, to see her only as the woman who was killed. She is that. But she was, first, a young widow of Leeds, with a mind and a laugh and a habit of chewing the corner of her lip when she was reading. She played the piano in the family parlour on Wortley Road. She was fond of currant cake. She wrote letters in a round, hurried hand to her sister Mary, who had married a man in the woolen trade and moved to a village on the Aire. She was, by every account we have, a gentle soul, and one who did not much like a quarrel. Whether she had begun, by that autumn, to grieve the first husband less, or more, or in some other way she could not name, the record does not say. Grief, as a rule, does not write itself into parish minute books. The Jenkinses were not, from the beginning, easy about William Dove. That is worth setting down plainly. Word of the placements had travelled. Leeds in the 1850s was still, for all its growth, a town where a good chapel family knew, within 2 Sundays, the story of any new attender. Harriet's uncle, a corn factor called Buttery, had heard of the fires at Barwick. Her mother had heard from a friend of the dog at the tradesman's on Brigate. None of it was proved. Some of it was probably wrong. But it had gathered around William's name in the town, and it did not lift, because he came now in a good coat and put a shilling in the plate. We do not, in truth, know how the two of them first spoke. Chapel courtships in that town at that time were done by very slow degrees. A word at the door, a shared hymn book, an offer to walk a lady and her mother the length of the pavement toward home, so long as the mother was between them, a cup of tea at the 3rd or 4th invitation, taken standing in a parlour with the aunt of the house watching from a chair by the fire. All of this, we may assume, happened. What was said in it between William and Harriet has not come down. If she wrote of him in her letters to her sister, those letters were not kept. If he wrote to her, he burned it after. So the record simply shows us Harriet, in the autumn of 1851, sitting in her pew with her hands folded, and William, 5 pews back, watching her. And then it shows us, some months on, the two of them coming out of the porch together after a service on a raw morning in the spring, with her mother a pace behind, and her uncle Buttery a pace behind her mother, and the whole family in a stiffness that anyone in the street could read. The mother's name was Jane. Jane Jenkins had lost her elder daughter's husband already, and she had watched Harriet go into black once, and she had thought that would be her portion of hard things. She did not want another. There is a letter, kept by the sister on the air, and quoted years later at the trial, in which Jane says, in as many words, that she wished this business of Mr. Dove would go by, that he was not a suitable young man, that his temper at times made her uneasy, that she had heard, from a source she trusted, of an incident at a chemist's shop in the town, and of another incident on a farm at Tadcaster, and that she wished Harriet would be patient, and wait, and see whether the Lord did not send her a steadier man. Harriet, in her reply, said she was very sorry to give her mother pain, and she was not, herself, unaware of the difficulties. But William had been very kind to her, and she thought she could be of use to him. That is her own phrase. She thought she could be of use to him. I want you to hold that phrase in your ear. There will be more than one moment later in this story when we come back to it. Take a breath here with me, because you have to sit for a second with the shape of that decision. A young widow of 22 in a house on Wortley Road, with a mother in a chair by the fire and a piano behind her and a sister on the air writing worried letters, chooses to marry a man her family has begged her not to. She does it not out of any wildness we can see in the record. She does it out of a quiet Methodist idea that a difficult soul may be steadied by a good wife. It is an idea that has ruined more women than any drink and any fire ever did, and it was, in her case, going to ruin her. The courtship, once it was set on its rails, moved through the winter of 1852 at the pace such things were done. There were meetings in the Jenkins parlour, taken now with the mother in the chair by the fire, and the uncle no longer at his post. There were walks on Woodhouse Moor on a Sunday afternoon, in a wind that carried the smoke of the mills across the grass. William, on those walks, is remembered as very grave, very correct, very careful of his hat, and inclined, when a subject grew warm, to go silent and let Harriet fill the pause. She filled it, by every account, with talk of chapel matters, and of a cousin's baby, and of a piece of music she had been trying to learn. He would nod. He would say, at the end, that it had been very pleasant to hear, and he would walk her back to the gate on Wortley Road, and lift his hat, and go. There is one exchange from that autumn that made its way, years later, into the account given by Harriet's cousin at the trial. The cousin was a young woman herself, and had walked with the two of them on one such Sunday afternoon on the moor. William had been quiet the whole way. Harriet had asked him, at some point on the path, what he thought about, when he was so quiet. William had answered, after a pause, that he was thinking about how many steps it took to walk to the bandstand from the gate. The cousin had laughed, because she thought it was a joke. Harriet had not laughed. Harriet had said, in the voice she used when she was steadying a child, that he must not tire himself with counting, and William had turned his face to her, without any change in it at all, and said that he did not tire. The cousin, telling that story on oath years later, added a thing that I have thought about since. She said that she had, on that afternoon on the moor, felt for the first time that Harriet already knew. Not what would come. No one could have known what would come. But that she already knew she had chosen a man who would not answer her the way another man would, and that she had made her peace with it, and that she was going forward anyway. It is the sort of thing a witness says with hindsight, and I would not put too much weight on it as evidence of Harriet's mind. But I put a great deal of weight on it as evidence of the atmosphere of that courtship, because the cousin was there, in a wind on Woodhouse Moor, and she remembered it, and she told it plain. The banns were called at Brunswick in the last weeks of the year. 3 Sundays running, the preacher read out the names of William Dove of Osmonthorpe and Harriet Jenkins, widow of Wortley, and asked, in the form the Methodists then used, whether any person present knew of any lawful cause why they should not be joined. No one in that chapel stood. Whether anyone thought of standing, and lost their courage, and sat back in the pew and let the moment pass, I could not tell you. It is easy to imagine an Uncle Buttery, in the second Sunday, half rising and then folding his hands again. That would be my imagining, and I mark it as mine. What the register says is that the banns were called 3 times and no impediment was declared, and the marriage was set for a Wednesday morning in the December of 1852. The morning came in under a low grey Leeds sky, the sort of sky that gives no particular light but does not, quite, rain. The chapel was cold. A coal fire had been lit in the small vestry off the porch, and there was a pot of tea for the wedding party after, but the meeting house itself was as cold as a barn, and the wedding guests kept their coats on. Harriet wore a dark grey dress and a bonnet trimmed with the same colour, because she was still, in her own reckoning, in the second stage of a widow's mourning, and a great white gown would not have been thought right. She carried no flowers. William stood beside her in the black coat, brushed for the day, with a plain necktie and a pair of new gloves in his hand that he did not put on. His mother Mary had come in from Osmonthorpe with Christopher in the cart. Christopher was in his best coat. Mary was in her only shawl. There is a moment from the ceremony that I want to give you before we go. It is not a large moment, and it is not in the newspapers, and I have it only from Harriet's sister on the air, who had it from Harriet by letter and told it, in her own words, at the trial. When the preacher came to the part where the bride and groom take one another's hands, William did not immediately extend his. He looked, for a breath, at Harriet's hand held out to him, as though it were a strange object he had not seen before. Then he took it. He did not smile. He did not press it. He simply held it, in the correct place, until the preacher had gone on. Harriet, her sister said, closed her fingers over his, and gave them one small warm squeeze that no one else in the chapel could see. William did not return it. He did not need to, the sister thought. He had been given a thing. He was holding it. There was a tea in the Jenkins parlour after, with currant cake and cold ham and a little sherry for the older women. William drank 1 cup of tea and ate 1 slice of ham and stood beside the piano and said very little. Harriet moved among the guests as brides do, with the pink of the day in her cheeks and a laugh that came a shade too easily. Her mother Jane sat in her chair by the fire and did not eat. Christopher and Mary Dove kept together by the window and made the sort of polite talk that farming people make in town parlours. Uncle Buttery stood in the doorway with his hands behind his back and watched William across the room, and the record does not say what he was thinking. The two of them left in the early dusk in a hired cab. They had taken a house on Cardigan Place, a modest brick terrace on a scraped stone step, in a district of Leeds that was neither the worst nor the best. It had a parlour with a horsehair sofa, a kitchen with a coal range, 2 bedrooms above, and a small yard behind with a coal hole and a line for washing. Harriet had brought her piano, and Elizabeth Fisher, a girl of 17 from a chapel family in Hunslet, was to come every morning to keep the range and to help with the household. It was, on paper, a beginning. The cab clattered west over the cobbles in the dusk, and Harriet, we may guess, watched the lamps come on in the windows as they went, and William, beside her, watched the road ahead, and counted, in the private way he had, whatever it was he counted when no one was looking. The gaslight in the parlour on Cardigan Place had not yet been lit that evening. It was waiting for them, blue and low, in the room where, 3 winters later, we would meet them first. The house on Cardigan Place. We must come back now to Cardigan Place. Back to the brick terrace with the scraped stone step. Back to the parlour with the horsehair sofa and the piano Harriet brought from her mother's house on Wortley Road. 3 years have gone by since we left the newly married couple in the hired cab, watching the lamps come on in the windows as they went. It is the winter of 1855 now, and the house has settled into a shape. You must picture it in the ordinary way first, because the ordinary way is what a neighbour on the pavement outside would have seen. A narrow front door, painted a dull green, a boot scraper set into the step, a brass number kept polished above the knocker, curtains of a heavy stuff drawn back in the morning by the servant girl and drawn together again in the early dusk by the mistress of the house, coal smoke rising from the chimney by 6:30 each morning, and again after 4 in the afternoon when the range was made up for the evening meal. On a Sunday, the front door would open at 9:45, and Harriet would come out in her dark bonnet, and William would come out behind her in his brushed coat, and the two of them would walk in the direction of Brunswick Chapel, with her hand set on his arm. That is what Cardigan Place saw. Come with me now through the door, into the passage where the coats are hung, and the umbrella stand holds 1 gentleman's umbrella and 1 lady's, and turn to the right into the parlour. The horsehair sofa is under the window, the piano stands against the far wall, a work basket sits on a low table by the fire, with a piece of Harriet's needlework laid across it, a sampler she never quite finishes, though the alphabet is done and the border half worked. On the mantel there is a clock that keeps steady time, a pair of brass candlesticks that were a wedding gift from the buttery uncle, and a china figure of a shepherdess that Harriet's mother sent in the first summer of the marriage. Between the shepherdess and the clock, in the winter we have now come to, sits a tea caddy of dark wood, with a brass lock and no key in it. The girl at the range in the kitchen is Elizabeth Fisher. She is 19 years old this winter. She has been in the house since the beginning, sent by a chapel family in Hunslet who knew the Jenkinses well. Elizabeth is a serious young woman with a very fair, very freckled face, and hands that are red at the knuckles from cold water. She keeps range hot from the first hour of the day to the last. She scrubs the flagged floor twice a week. She takes the ashes out to the coal hole in the yard in a tin pail. She sleeps in a narrow bed in a box room above the kitchen, with a wooden crucifix on the wall that had been her grandmother's, though the Fishers were Methodist and did not, as a rule, keep such things in the house. Elizabeth is the one who saw, that has to be said now, at the start, because she is the reason we have so much of what follows. She was the eye inside the walls. The doctor came, for the first time we can date, in the March of 1853, which was the 3rd month of the marriage. Harriet had taken to her bed after supper with what she called a heaviness in her head and a shaking in her hands. William, who had at that point still shown himself a decent enough husband to a girl from Wortley Road, went himself to the door of Mr. Morley's surgery on Park Square and asked him to come. Mr. Morley, whose name we already know from William's boyhood at the chemist's, was by then a settled man of the town, in a black coat and a plain necktie, with a way of speaking to nervous wives that was much respected. He came within the hour. He looked at Harriet's tongue and felt her pulse and asked her what she had eaten and drunk that day, and he told her, at the end, that it was a case of the nerves, and that she should keep her feet warm and drink a little brandy and water in the evenings, and go to bed early. He came back a great many times after that. The visits, in the beginning, were far apart. One in the summer of 1853, one in the November, one in the following spring. By 1854 he was calling every few weeks. By the autumn of 1855 he was in the house so often that Elizabeth had learned to set the second cup on the tray by habit. Whatever the matter was, he still called it nerves. Harriet's fits, when they came, took the form of a stiffness through the arms and a throwing back of the head, and a set of the jaw that made her teeth clench, and a wetting of the mouth. They passed in 10 minutes or half an hour. She would sleep afterwards for the greater part of a day. Mr. Morley would leave a draught of a mild kind, and instructions about the brandy and water, and he would take his hat from the hall. Whether Mr. Morley had begun by then to wonder in his private mind about the shape of what he was seeing, the record does not clearly say. He wrote no letters in that period that survive. At the trial, later, he was careful of his answers, as a doctor of the town would be. He said that he had, by 1855, considered whether the fits might not be entirely of a nervous origin. He said he had turned the question over more than once. He did not say what he had done with the turning. I want to stop here for a breath, because I know how it sounds, laid out plainly at the fireside of a winter evening. It sounds as though every person in the town of Leeds ought to have seen. It sounds as though Mr. Morley, at the very least, ought to have known. And the truth is that they did not, or would not, or could not, quite let themselves. Doctors in 1855 were not doctors in the sense we might use the word now. Wives in that town had fits. Wives were tired. Wives were nervous. Brandy and water was the answer to a great many things that a doctor could not name. Mr. Morley did what a Leeds doctor did in a Leeds parlour. He would come to wish, later in the year, that he had done more. Elizabeth, in the kitchen, saw the bruises before any doctor did. They were not the bruises of a beating in the way a fight in a street gives a beating. They were the bruises of a hand at a wrist, or of a shoulder pressed against a door frame, or of fingers taken hard around an upper arm to steady a woman who did not want to be steadied. Harriet took to wearing her sleeves to the knuckle in the house, in the summer months as well as the winter. When Elizabeth brought the wash basin in the morning, the mistress would turn her face to the wall while she washed. The servant did not ask. She had been raised in a chapel family in Hunslet, and she knew that a girl of 19 at the range did not ask. There is one afternoon in the July of 1855 that Elizabeth would give in evidence later, and I want to give it to you now. Harriet had come down to the parlour after her afternoon rest, with a mark on the side of her jaw that had not been there in the morning. The mark was the width of a man's thumb. She sat at the piano and began a piece of music that Elizabeth had heard her play many times, and she played it wrong, and she stopped, and she began it again, and she played it wrong a second time. Then she took her hands from the keys and folded them in her lap and looked at the fire. Elizabeth, who had come in with the tea tray, set the tray down on the low table and stood there for a moment, waiting to be spoken to, and Harriet, without turning, said in a very even voice that Elizabeth might go. Elizabeth went. On the stairs down to the kitchen she heard the piano begin the piece a third time, and get it right, and go on to the end. She said afterwards at the trial that she had cried in the scullery for a full quarter of an hour, and that she could not have said, then, why. The record does not tell us what was said between William and Harriet in the bedroom that had, by that same summer, begun to be kept locked at certain hours of the day. I want to be honest with you about that. There are no letters, no diary entries, no overheard sentences that survive. What we have is the fact of the lock, and Elizabeth's evidence that the key was in William's pocket, and Harriet's mother's evidence that when she called at Cardigan Place on a Wednesday afternoon in the September of that year and asked to see her daughter, she was told by William, at the front door, that Harriet was resting and that she could not be disturbed, and that the door at the top of the stairs was, when Jane Jenkins pressed past him and went up, in fact locked. Jane stood on the landing and called her daughter's name. Harriet answered from inside, in a voice that seemed to Jane a very tired voice, that she was quite well, and that she would come to Wortley Road on the Sunday. She did not come on the Sunday. She came the Sunday after, on William's arm, in a long-sleeved dress and a bonnet drawn close to her face. Jane Jenkins, in her evidence, said she did not know what to do. That is not an evasion. That is the truth of a mother in a Leeds parlour in 1855. There was no place, in the town or in the law, to take a suspicion of that shape. A wife belonged to her husband. A locked bedroom door was a matter for the husband and the wife, and, at furthest, the minister at Brunswick, who had already spoken to William once and got, for his trouble, the correct answers in the correct voice, and had come away, he said afterwards, feeling that he had somehow been the one questioned. Come back with me to the kitchen, to Elizabeth at the range, in the last hour of the evening. when the plates from supper have been washed and the flags have been given their sweep. This is where William comes when the light in the parlour has been turned out and Harriet has gone up the stairs. He comes down in his shirt sleeves. He does not speak to the girl. He sits on a wooden chair by the range, with a bottle of brandy on the deal table and a tumbler beside it, and he drinks, in a steady, patient way, until the bottle is not full any more. Elizabeth is not permitted to go to her bed until the master has gone up. So she sits at the far end of the table with a piece of mending in her lap, and she keeps her eyes on the mending, and she waits. He would talk sometimes, not to her, through her, as though the range and the pans on the wall and the servant at the far end of the deal were all one listener. He would say that the doctors did not know their business. He would say that his wife had been a nervous woman before he married her, and that he could not be blamed for what her nerves did. He would say, once or twice, that a man in Leeds had told him a thing about the future that he would tell her one day, and see whether she was as clever then. He would laugh at that, in the flat way we already know. Then he would go up the stairs, heavy on the treads, and Elizabeth would damp the range and take her own candle and climb to the box room and lie there for a long time before sleep took her. The man in Leeds who had told him a thing about the future, we have already met in the outline for what is coming. I will not use his name yet in this chapter, because Elizabeth did not know it, and I want you to sit for a stretch inside her knowledge of the house, which was very great, and inside her ignorance of what was gathering outside it, which was very great too. She knew the bruises. She knew the lock. She knew the brandy at the deal table. She did not know that on a Tuesday morning in the January of 1856, William had walked into a narrow passage off Boar Lane and knocked at a door with no nameplate and paid 2 shillings for a reading of cards and asked a question that no honest man should ask. The winter came down hard on Cardigan Place in the January of 1856. There was frost on the inside of the kitchen window in the mornings and ice in the horse troughs on the road at the end of the terrace. Harriet's fits had drawn closer together. Mr. Morley was calling twice a week. The piano had not been opened since before Christmas. The tea caddy on the mantel between the shepherdess and the clock had begun, in that same month, to hold something besides tea, folded very small behind the loose paper lining at the back. The candles burned low, and the parlour on Cardigan Place, orderly to any eye at the window, was already the room in which a wife was being killed. The Wizard of Leeds. We have to leave the kitchen now, leave Elizabeth at the deal table with her mending, and the master upstairs on the treads, and the frost on the inside of the window. We have to go with William on the Tuesday morning that Elizabeth did not know about, out of the front door of Cardigan Place at a little after 10, and down into the town. It is a walk of not much more than half an hour, but I want you to make it slowly with him, because a great deal turns on where he is going, and it will help you to see the town he had to cross to get there. The way from Cardigan Place to the centre of Leeds went east along a run of terraces very like his own, and then across the top of North Street and down toward the great open space of Brigate. Brigate, on a January morning in 1856, was the market street of a town in the middle of becoming a city. It ran wide between shop fronts of dressed stone, with drapers and stationers and grocers and bootmakers standing in a long row, and between the shops the mouths of a great many alleys and passages, cut back from the pavement into courts and yards that most respectable townspeople never entered. Boar Lane crossed the foot of Brigate at a slight angle, and off Boar Lane, on the northern side, a narrow passage ran back between a chandler's and a public house whose name has gone. That passage was where William turned in. Henry Harrison, the man he was going to see, was not much thought of by the newspapers of the town while he lived. He is remembered now because William Dove made him remembered. But you must understand that a cunning man of that kind was, in 1856, an ordinary feature of a great English city, and not the sort of oddity a stranger would come specially to gawp at. In every town of any size, in a room up a back stair or down a passage from a busy street, there sat a man or a woman who read cards, or tea leaves, or the palm of a hand, or the water in a bowl, and told a farm girl whether the young man she was thinking of would prove true, and told a widow whether her son at sea was still alive, and told a shopkeeper whether the sickness in his stomach would kill him by Easter. They took a shilling for the shorter readings and 2 shillings for the longer, and, in some houses, a great deal more for a matter that was thought to touch on the future of another person's life. Harrison kept the middle floor of a narrow brick building set well back from Boar Lane. The ground floor was a storeroom for the chandler in front, and smelt of tallow. A wooden stair up to Harrison's room had been worn in the middle of each tread by many boots. There was no nameplate on his door, and no card in his window. He did not need one. The word went by mouth, in the yards and the public houses, and by the middle of the 1850s there was a fair traffic up his stair on any given morning. Servant girls in bonnets, tradesmen's wives in shawls, sailors newly paid off at Hull who had come up the line to Leeds for the day, and, now and then, a gentleman in a decent coat who kept his hat pulled low. The room itself, when the door was opened to you, was not what the town gossip promised. No skull sat on a shelf, no crystal ball rested on a stand. A scrubbed deal table stood under a window that gave onto the roofs of Brigate, with 2 wooden chairs, and, on the wall behind it, a very old print of the Angel of the Annunciation, framed in black. On the table, under a folded cloth, lay the pack of cards. Beside the cards stood a china teapot with a chipped lip, and a caddy of black tea, and 2 cups without saucers. That was the whole of it. Harrison had learned, over the years, that a room too full of trappings made a farmer suspicious. A room that looked like a scullery, with one old print of an angel on the wall, made a farmer sit down. The man himself was perhaps 50. He had a lean face, high in the cheekbone, and hair that had gone grey early and been kept cropped very short, so that it stood up from his head like the pile on a brush. He wore a working man's coat and a linen shirt without a collar. His hands were what you noticed, long-fingered and kept clean, as a witness would say afterwards at the trial, in the way a man who does not work with his hands can afford to keep them. He spoke with a Leeds accent, softened, as though he had picked up the trick of dropping the harder edges when he was working. He offered his callers tea before he offered them anything else. He would sit them down at the deal table and pour, and he would not speak of their business until they had drunk. I want to be careful here, because there is a great deal about Henry Harrison we simply do not know. The record does not tell us where he was born, or what trade his father was, or whether he had a wife of his own. It does not tell us when he first began to read cards for coin, or whether he had ever, in his own private mind, believed in what he did. There were men in his line who were true believers, and there were men in it who were pure tradesmen, and there were men in it who were both at once, and could not have told you where one ended and the other began. Harrison, so far as the record shows him, might have been any of the 3. That is a real gap, and I am not going to paper it over. What we do have is the account of that first visit, given by Harrison himself at the Assize Court at York 6 months later, in a voice the papers called steady and rather bored. William Dove had come up the stair, he said, on a Tuesday morning in the January of 1856. He had knocked in the ordinary way. He had come in, taken off his hat, and sat down on the wooden chair without waiting to be asked. Harrison, who was accustomed to reading a caller from the shoulders before ever the cards were touched, said afterwards that he had marked the man at once as one who had come with a settled thing in his mind, and not with a question he was still turning. They took the tea. William drank his in 3 swallows, and set the cup down without a sound. Harrison, in no hurry, poured for himself a second time. Then he laid a cloth over the deal table and cut the cards. The reading he gave that morning was, by his own account, a general one. He spoke of a house that had grown heavy on its owner. A woman inside it, he said, was failing in her health, and a change of season would come, before long, in the family's affairs. All of this was the ordinary furniture of the trade, and would have fitted any tradesman's wife in the town who had come up the stair with a heavy heart. William listened without moving. At the end of the reading, William put down his 2 shillings on the deal table and picked up his hat. He was already at the door before he turned back. He asked Harrison whether the cards would say when a person in a house would die. Not whether, he said, when. Harrison, in his evidence, said he had answered that the cards did not, as a rule, tell such a thing plainly, but that a skilful hand could sometimes read a nearness in them. William stood at the door a moment longer, Then he said he would come again, and he went down the stair. Stop with me here for a breath, because this is the hinge of the whole matter, and it is very easy to miss how narrow a hinge it is. A man of 30, in a good coat, has walked half an hour across the town of Leeds and paid 2 shillings for a reading, and asked, at the door on his way out, whether a card reader can tell him when his wife will die. Harrison, hearing it, did not throw him down the stair. He did not walk over to the window and open it and shout for the constable at the corner of Boar Lane. He said, in as many words, that the cards might sometimes read a nearness, and he took the 2 shillings, and he put them in the drawer of the deal table with the others, and he went to the head of the stair to watch the next boot come up. I am not going to pretend that I know what was in Harrison's mind at the top of that stair. He would say later, at York, that he had thought the man an eccentric, and no more. A great many callers, in his account, asked him about deaths in their houses, an ailing mother, a father in the workhouse, a child in a fever, and it was a matter of no rarity for a man to ask when. He had put the visit out of his head by the afternoon, or so he told the court. That is his account. It is also, in the shape of the trade he was in, quite possibly true. A cunning man who let every strange question rattle him would not have lasted a year on the stair off Boar Lane. Harrison had lasted, by that January, longer than most. William came back the next week. He came back the week after. By the middle of February, he was coming twice in a 7-day stretch, and he had begun, on the 2nd visit or the 3rd, to name the person the readings were to concern. Her name was Harriet. She was his wife. She had been ill a long time. The doctors could do nothing for her. He wanted to know whether the cards saw an end to her illness, and, if they did, how soon. Harrison read for him each time. He read, by his own admission at York, in ways that took the 2 shillings and gave back what the man had come to hear. He spoke of a fading strength. A candle, he said, was burnt down to the last inch. Rest would come to the woman, in his reading of the cards, before the spring was full out. William would sit on the wooden chair with his hands flat on his knees and take it in and pay and go. He never once, in any of the visits, showed grief at what he was being told. Harrison marked that too, and did not, at the time, mark it enough. We come now to the visit that mattered, and I want you to sit forward for it, because it is the visit at which the ordinary trade of the passage off Boar Lane crossed a line and became something else. It was a Thursday morning at the very end of February in 1856. Whether the weather was frost or thaw, the record does not say. William came up the stair at his usual hour and sat and drank the tea and waited through a reading of the cards that told him nothing he had not been told the week before. When Harrison had finished, William did not put the 2 shillings on the table. He put 4 shillings on the table. Then he asked whether Harrison, besides reading the cards, wrote charms. Harrison, on oath, said that he had answered yes. He had written charms for many years, mostly for lovers and for women who were afraid of a rival in the town, and now and then for a farmer who thought his cattle had been overlooked by a neighbour with a squint. He wrote them on scraps of paper in a hand that was meant to look like an old hand, with words half in Latin and half in a made-up tongue of his own, and he charged, for a lesser charm, half a crown, and for a larger, whatever he thought the caller could bear. William, on that Thursday morning, asked him for a charm that would hasten the death of his wife. Harrison, in his evidence, said he had refused at first. Whether that is true, or whether it is the sort of thing a man on oath at an assize court says to save his own neck, I would not want to swear to. What is not in doubt, because the paper itself was produced at the trial and read out in open court, is that Harrison did in the end sit down at the deal table under the print of the Angel of the Annunciation, and take a scrap of paper and write on it in his old-looking hand a few lines of half Latin and half nothing, and fold it small, and take from William, for that folded scrap, a sum of 10 shillings, a great sum for a working man of Leeds in that year, and a sum William paid without a word. He came back down the stair with the paper in the inside pocket of his coat. He walked home to Cardigan Place along Boar Lane, and up through Bridgegate and across the top of North Street, in the same coat he had gone out in, at the same steady walking pace. He let himself into the house with his own key. He hung the coat on the hook in the passage, and he went into the parlour, and he took the paper from the pocket, and he folded it once again and pushed it in behind the loose paper lining at the back of the tea caddy that stood on the mantel between the shepherdess and the clock. Elizabeth Fisher, the servant girl from Hunslet, was in the kitchen when he came in. Harriet was upstairs. Neither of them heard him move the caddy. The candle in the parlour had not yet been lit. The clock on the mantel was ticking on toward noon. Somewhere over the roofs of Leeds, a chapel bell answered a lesser bell in a nearer street. In the passage off Boar Lane, Henry Harrison, having taken 10 shillings for a folded scrap of paper, sat down at his deal table and cut the cards again for a servant girl who had come up the stair to ask about a young man in a printer's yard. And in the surgery of Mr. Morley on Park Square, a young apprentice who slept on a truckle bed in the back room was setting out the day's bottles on a shelf, and had not yet noticed that a caller in a good coat had, that same week, begun to ask questions about the brown jar on the top shelf that was kept, in the ordinary way, well out of reach. The paper behind the tea caddy. We must go back into the parlour on Cardigan Place, back to the mantel, and the china shepherdess, and the tea caddy of dark wood with the brass lock and no key in it. William has come home from Boar Lane, with the folded paper in the inside pocket of his coat, and the paper is now behind the loose lining at the back of the caddy, and no one else in the house knows it is there. That is where we are. It is the last day of February, in the year 1856, and the winter has one more thing to do in this house before the thaw comes. I want to tell you at the beginning that the record for what follows is fuller than the record for almost anything else in the case. It is fuller because Elizabeth Fisher, at the range in the kitchen, kept her eyes open. It is fuller because Mr. Morley wrote up his visits, in a book he later brought into court. It is fuller because a young apprentice on Park Square, in the March of that year, sat down with a piece of paper and made a list of what had gone missing from a brown jar on a top shelf. Between those three, we have the shape of 10 days. The shape is not merciful. We have to leave the parlour again for a moment, though, because before we can measure a first dose, we have to walk with William to the place where the measure came from. On the first morning of March, he went out of the front door at 9:30 in the same brushed coat, and he did not go east into the town. He went south, across the top of North Street, and then round to the west of the General Infirmary, and down onto Park Square. Park Square in that year was a set of tall stone houses ranged about a formal garden, given over almost entirely to the surgeries of physicians and solicitors. The plane trees in the garden had not yet broken bud. The pavement was wet. The knocker on Mr. Morley's door was answered, as it was answered every morning of the week, by the young apprentice who slept in the back room. His name was James Peacock. He was 19 years old. He had been apprenticed to Mr. Morley for 4 years, and he had another 3 to serve before he could set up on his own. Peacock is not the sort of figure history tends to remember, and I had not heard his name until I went looking. He is worth naming, because without the ledger he kept in a careful hand at the deal counter in the dispensing room, we would not know what William Dove bought that morning, or what he came back and bought again on the 4th of March, or on the 7th. Peacock, on oath at York, would say that William Dove was known to him. William had run errands for Mr. Morley as a boy of 13 or 14, in the season the family had put him with the chemist, and had learned in that season a great many of the names on the labels of the brown glass jars. Peacock said William came into the dispensing room on that first morning of March with the easy manner of a man who had once had the run of the place. He looked along the shelves. He asked, in the way of an idle question, whether the strychnine was still kept on the top shelf on the right, behind the door. Peacock said it was. William said he had a rat in the coal hole at Cardigan Place. He asked whether he might have as much as would kill it, and he laid a shilling on the counter. Peacock, in the ordinary practice of the surgery, ought to have entered the sale in the poisons book, with the buyer's full name, and the buyer's address, and the intended use. He entered it in the day book instead, which was the book in which he entered ordinary small sales. He wrote, in a hand that would be shown to a jury in July, the word Dove and the sum of 1 shilling, and beside it, in the column for the article, the letters S.T. He did not enter an address. He did not enter an intended use. He measured out from the brown jar on the top shelf a quantity that he would later swear had been enough to kill perhaps a dozen rats, but was very far from being enough to kill a person, and he put it into a twist of blue paper, and he passed it across the deal counter, and William took it and put it into the pocket of his coat, and he went out. Stop with me here for a breath, because I want to be careful in what I say next about the young man at the counter. Peacock was 19. He had a master who was often out of the house. He had known William Dove for years. He would tell the court, later, that he had not for one moment considered that the strychnine was for a person, and that his conscience on that head was clear. I have read his evidence 3 times, and I still cannot tell you, with any certainty, whether that is a truth or a shield. The record does not go into a young man's mind. It goes only as far as the daybook, and the daybook says a shilling, and the letters ST, and no address. William walked home along the same route by which he had come. He did not turn aside into a public house. He did not stop at a chapel. He came in at the front door of Cardigan Place at a little after 11. He hung the coat on the hook in the passage, as he had hung it on the day he had come home from Boar Lane. He did not take the twist of blue paper out of the pocket at once. He left it in the coat, and he went through into the parlour, and he sat down at the little writing table by the window, and he wrote, in the ledger of a small mill account he kept for a friend of his father's, 3 lines of figures. Elizabeth, on the flags in the passage with a bucket in her hand, saw him at the table through the open door as she went by, and she said afterwards that his hand had been perfectly steady on the pen. Harriet, upstairs, was having one of her better mornings. She had risen at 9:30. She had drunk a cup of weak tea. She had come down at 10 and sat in the parlour with her needlework across her knees, and had done 6 stitches and had gone back up to lie down. She was pale, in Elizabeth's account, but not shaking. She had told Elizabeth on the stairs that she thought she might, after luncheon, walk as far as the corner and back, if the sky held. The sky did not hold. By 1 in the afternoon a thin rain had come on across the roofs of the town, and Harriet did not go out. She sat in the parlour instead, with a shawl over her shoulders, and she asked William, at about 4, whether he would have the goodness to fetch her the brandy and water Mr. Morley had recommended for her nerves. William, on the horsehair sofa opposite, folded his newspaper and said he would fetch it himself and would not trouble Elizabeth. He got up and went out to the kitchen. Elizabeth was at the range. He asked her, in a pleasant enough voice, for a glass and for the bottle of brandy from the cupboard, and for the kettle to be brought over to warm the water. He carried the glass and the bottle and the kettle back into the parlour on a small japanned tray, and he closed the parlour door behind him with his heel. Elizabeth heard the door click shut. She had never heard the parlour door closed against her in the afternoon before. We have to be careful now, because we are at the moment we cannot see. Elizabeth was on the other side of the door. Mr. Morley was on the other side of the town. Peacock was on the other side of the garden of plane trees. The only 2 people in the parlour were William and Harriet was already very tired, and William did not, at any time in the 5 months that were left of his life, tell any living soul what he had done in that room in the quarter of an hour between 4:05 and 4:20 on the 1st of March in 1856. The paper in the tea caddy was behind him on the mantel. The twist of blue paper from Park Square was in the pocket of the coat in the passage. What we have, after that, is what Harriet drank, and what her body did in the next hour, and what Elizabeth found when the door opened again. Harriet took the brandy and water at about 4:15. She drank it slowly, in the manner of a woman who had been told by her doctor to sip. She said, in Elizabeth's later account of what she was told afterwards by the mistress herself, that the drink had a sharper edge to it than she was used to, and that she supposed her husband had been heavy-handed with the brandy. William, in the same account, laughed at the fireside, and said that a heavy hand was what a nervous wife required. Harriet finished the glass and set it down on the low table by the sofa. The clock on the mantel ticked on toward the half-hour. At about 4:20, she began to shake. I want to describe this carefully, because the shaking of a body poisoned with strychnine is one of the recognized horrors of the 19th century, and it was to be seen 4 times in that parlour over the 10 days that followed. Strychnine acts on the spine. It draws the muscles of the back and the neck and the jaw into a stiffness that will not let go. The body arches. The arms lock at the elbows. The face pulls back from the teeth in a grimace that no living person would ever wear on purpose. The mind, all through it, is clear. The person can hear the clock on the mantel. The person can see the shepherdess and the tea caddy. The person can hear their own husband ask, in a tone of concern, whether it is one of her usual attacks. The person cannot move to answer. Harriet's first fit that afternoon lasted a little over 10 minutes. It passed. She fell back against the arm of the sofa with the sweat cold on her forehead, and she began to weep in a very quiet way, and she asked, in a voice she could barely raise above a breath, that William send for Mr. Morley. William, in his own account and in Elizabeth's, went at once to the passage and put on his coat and walked to Park Square himself. He did not send Elizabeth. He wanted, we can suppose, to be the one who told the doctor the story. He was at Mr. Morley's door in a quarter of an hour, and Mr. Morley came back with him within half an hour after that, and by the time the two of them had climbed the step at Cardigan Place, Harriet was sitting up in the parlour with the shawl drawn round her again, and the fit had entirely passed. Mr. Morley examined her. He held her wrist. He looked at her tongue. He asked her what she had eaten. Harriet told him, faintly, that she had eaten nothing since breakfast, and had taken only a cup of weak tea in the morning and a glass of brandy and water in the afternoon, and Mr. Morley made a note of both of those things in the small book he carried in his coat. He asked her whether she felt able to eat a piece of dry toast. She said she would try. He told her to go to bed early, and he said, as he had said many times before, that these were nervous attacks, and that a warm room and a light diet would do her a great deal of good. He went out into the passage with William. Elizabeth, from the top of the kitchen stairs, saw William see him to the door. Whether Mr. Morley, on Park Square that evening, sat down in the room behind the dispensing room and turned the visit over in his mind, we do not know for certain. He wrote in his book that Harriet had had another fit, and that the fit had passed off in the usual way, and that the pulse afterwards had been rapid but not alarming, and that he had prescribed rest. He did not write down, on that first evening, any suspicion of a poison. What Peacock, at his deal counter, was doing on that same evening, we do not know either. He had not spoken to his master about the shilling and the letters S.T. The day-book was closed. The brown jar on the top shelf on the right, behind the door, was still nearly full. We have to come back once more to the parlour, because the room does not empty for us at the end of the afternoon. Harriet went up to bed at 7, on William's arm, and Elizabeth carried a warming pan up the stairs behind them. William came down again at past. He stood for a moment at the mantel. He took the tea caddy in his hands, and turned it once, and set it back between the shepherdess and the clock. Elizabeth, at the parlour door with a tray, saw him do it, and thought nothing of it, and said afterwards at York that she had thought nothing of it, and that she had not, then, known there was any reason to. He went down to the kitchen, and he sat at the deal table, and he asked her for the bottle of brandy again, and he drank in his ordinary, steady, patient way, and he did not speak, and he did not laugh. Come away from Cardigan Place now for a breath, because I do not want to keep you sitting in that kitchen with Elizabeth on the far end of the deal any longer than we have to. Outside, in the town, the rain had thickened. The gas lamps on Boar Lane were lit. In the passage off Boar Lane, Henry Harrison had taken in a servant girl, and a chandler's widow, and a young clerk from the railway office, and had shut his door for the night, and had not thought, in his own account, of William Dove at all. In the back room on Park Square, James Peacock had eaten his supper, and had not opened the day-book. In the manse at Brunswick Chapel, the minister who had once been questioned by William and had come away, he said, feeling that he had been the one questioned, was writing his sermon for the coming Sunday on the text of Proverbs, and had not thought of Cardigan Place in weeks. Only 3 people in the town of Leeds, that first night of March, knew that anything had begun. William, at the deal table with the brandy, Harriet, asleep upstairs, with the taste of the sharper edge on her mouth already fading, and, in a folded scrap of paper behind the loose lining at the back of the tea caddy on the mantel, the wizard's charm, which knew nothing of anything, and had never known anything, and had only been a piece of paper on which a lean-faced man in a room off Boar Lane had written a few lines of half-Latin, and had taken 10 shillings, and had put the shillings in the drawer of a scrubbed deal table, under an old print of the Angel of the Annunciation. The clock on the mantel ticked on. In the coal hole at the back of the house, no rat had died. In the bedroom at the top of the stairs, Harriet turned in her sleep and did not wake, and drew a long, slow breath and let it out again into the dark. The long dying. We have to sit with her now for 10 days. I wish we did not, and I wish I could tell you the record allows us to look away. It does not. What follows is what Elizabeth saw, and what Mr. Morley wrote in the book he carried in his coat, and what a second doctor from a second street would in the end come and set down in his own hand. Between the three of them, we have most of what there is. We do not have everything. We never will. The 2nd of March was a Sunday. Harriet came down at 11, on William's arm, in her second-best dress, and she sat by the fire in the parlour. She had slept, in her own account to Elizabeth on the stair, better than she had expected to after the fit of the day before. Her lips were the colour of thin paper. The hands on the arms of the chair trembled when she reached for her cup, but she said the trembling was nothing, and that she had felt it many times in the years of her illness. Elizabeth brought in a thin gruel with a spoonful of honey, and Harriet ate half of it, and William read to her from the newspaper in a voice Elizabeth called even and mild. The chapel bells came in through the shutters at noon and again at 3. Neither husband nor wife went out. I want you to notice what does not happen on this Sunday. William did not go back to Park Square. He did not walk to Boar Lane. He sat in the parlour with his wife, and he read her the shipping intelligence from the Leeds Mercury and the report of a lecture on the temperance question at the music hall. Harriet, in Elizabeth's later account, said twice in the afternoon that she felt in better spirits than she had in months, and she asked whether they might, in a week or so, take a train as far as Wortley to visit her mother. William said that they might. He said it in the same even voice. He said it, so far as we can tell, without moving his face. That evening, at 7:45, Harriet's second fit began. It began exactly as the first had begun. Her shoulders went first, then her jaw, then the long muscles along her spine drew tight, and her body arched away from the chair, and her hands locked at her sides with the fingers held out straight. She could not cry out. Elizabeth, who had come in with the tea things, dropped the tray on the flags. Mr. Morley was fetched in great haste, and was there within 20 minutes, and this time the fit was still under way when he arrived. He saw it. He held her wrist through the length of it. He counted the beats of her pulse. When it passed, he sat back in the chair opposite and looked at his patient in a way, Elizabeth said, that he had not looked at her before. Let me be careful here about Mr. Morley. He was not a country apothecary. He was a Leeds physician of 30 years' standing, with rooms on Park Square and a practice among the mill managers and the wool merchants of the town, and he had seen in that 30 years a great many nervous women and a great many convulsions of many kinds. He was not a fool. He wrote in his book that Sunday night that the fits of Mrs. Dove were of a character he did not entirely understand, and that they seemed to him to have in them something of the rigidity of tetanus and something of the pattern of hysteria, and that he could not, on the evidence before him, be certain which. He asked William, at the parlour door on the way out, whether there had been any wound in the past week, a nail in the sole of a boot, a splinter in a hand, a bite from a dog. William said there had been none. Mr. Morley nodded, and went home to Park Square in the rain, and sat up until 11:30 with his book open on his knee, and did not go to bed until he had written, in a hand that would be shown to a jury in July, the single word strychnia, and then, after it, the words but from whence. He did not act on the word. That is the truth of it, and it is one of the sadder truths of the case. Mr. Morley wrote strychnia in his own book on the 2nd of March, and he did not, on the 3rd, go back to Cardigan Place and lift the tea caddy from the mantel and turn it out onto the parlour table. He went instead about his ordinary round. He called at Cardigan Place at 10, and found Harriet weak and drowsy but at peace, and he prescribed beef tea and rest, and he came away. On the 3rd of March, William walked again to Park Square. He did not go into the surgery. He waited across the garden of plane trees until he saw Mr. Morley leave for his rounds, and then he went in at the door and up to the deal counter. Peacock was alone in the dispensing room. William asked, once more in his ordinary voice, for as much strychnia as would kill a second rat in the coal hole. The first not, he said, having done its work. Peacock, in his later evidence, said he had been about to refuse. He said he had begun the words of a refusal. He said William had laid 2 shillings on the counter this time, and had looked at him without blinking, and had asked how long the young gentleman had been apprenticed to Mr. Morley, and whether he liked the work. Peacock, at 19, opened the Poisons book at last, and wrote the sale in it, and he wrote Dove and Cardigan Place, and he wrote, in the intended use column, the word rats, and he passed across the counter a second twist of blue paper. He did not go and find his master. We have to leave Park Square now, because the days that follow do not need much retelling, and I do not want to keep you at each of them for long. What happens is that William takes home the second twist of paper, and he does with it what he did with the first. A fit came on the evening of the 4th of March, and it was worse than the second, and Mr. Morley was fetched, and Mr. Morley this time brought with him a colleague from Park Row, a Dr. Nunnally, who had read more of the recent literature on strychnia than Mr. Morley had. Nunnally sat by the sofa and watched the fit pass off. He said nothing at the bedside. He walked the length of the passage with Mr. Morley at the end of the visit, and there, in a voice pitched below Elizabeth's hearing at the kitchen stairs, told him what he thought. Nunnally thought poison. He would say so at York in July, in a voice the papers called grave. He told Mr. Morley in the passage that the pattern of the fits, and the intervals between them, and the clear rigidity of the spine, matched no ordinary tetanus he had ever seen, and matched no hysteria at all, and matched almost exactly the descriptions in the French papers of strychnia poisoning by repeated doses. He asked Mr. Morley whether there was anyone in the house who might have a reason. Mr. Morley, in Nunnally's own account, said he could think of no such person, and that the husband seemed devoted, and had been at his wife's side through every attack. Here is one of the gaps we cannot close. We do not know what Nunnally said next. We do not know whether he pressed his colleague to speak to the police, or whether he shrugged, and put on his hat, and went back to Park Row, and to his own patients, and told himself that he had done what he could by naming the name. His evidence at York does not tell us. He was asked, and he said only that he had left the matter in Mr. Morley's hands, as the physician of longer standing in the house. That is the whole of what we have. 2 doctors on the pavement of Cardigan Place on the evening of the 4th of March, in the rain, with a name spoken between them, and neither of them putting on their coats the next morning to walk to the town hall. On the 5th, Harriet rallied. She sat up. She ate a piece of dry toast. She sent, in Elizabeth's account, a note to her sister on Wortley Road, asking whether she might come the following week for a day. On the 6th, at 6 in the evening, she was struck by the 4th fit, and this one lasted a full quarter of an hour, and when it passed she could not speak clearly for above an hour afterwards, and her right hand did not entirely still until the morning. Mr. Morley came. Mr. Morley did not send for Nunnally this time. He sat by the sofa with his book on his knee, and he wrote the beats of the pulse, and he prescribed a draught of laudanum for the night, and he came away. I want to bring Elizabeth into this now, because we have kept her at the kitchen door for too long. Elizabeth Fisher was 17 years old. She had been in service since she was 11. She could read a printed page, but she could not write more than her own name. She was not clever in the way the courts of 1856 understood cleverness. She was, however, a girl who had been raised in a house where a mother had died of a wasting cough over 8 months, and she knew the difference between an illness that came and went of itself and an illness that answered to what a person had been given to drink. On the evening of the 6th, after Mr. Morley had gone, and William had gone out to the passage to see him to the door, Elizabeth stepped into the parlour with a fresh cloth for her mistress's forehead, and she saw the glass on the low table by the sofa, and she saw that the glass, which she had washed that morning with her own hands, had in it now a thin ring of pale sediment at the bottom that had not been there when she washed it, and that was not the sediment of tea, and was not the sediment of brandy, and was, so far as she could name it, the sediment of nothing she had ever seen at the bottom of any glass in any kitchen she had worked in. She stared at it for a long moment. She did not touch it. She heard William's step in the passage. She turned away, and she went out with the empty tray, and she did not, that night, say a word to anyone. You have to understand what she was carrying, and what it meant for a girl of her age and her wages to carry it. She had £5 a year and her keep. She had no family in the town. If she went to the police with a suspicion of a poisoning by her master, and the suspicion turned out to be wrong, she would lose her place and her character, and she would not be taken in again in Leeds, and she would end at the workhouse gate on Beckett Street, and everyone in the service hall knew it. She did not go to the police. She kept her eyes open instead. On the 7th of March, when William asked her to fetch the bottle of brandy from the cupboard for his wife's afternoon draught, she brought the bottle and set it on the tray, and she stood a moment longer in the parlour than she had ever stood before, and she watched, from the corner of her eye at the door, as William took the twist of blue paper from an inside pocket of his coat, and, with his back turned to her, tipped a portion of it into the glass. She looked away, she went out, she stood on the flags of the passage with the empty tray against her hip, and, in her own words at York, she felt her legs shake under her for the first time in her life. There was a fit on the 7th, there was a fit on the 8th, worse than the 7th. There was a fit at 2 in the morning of the 10th. Between them, Harriet lay upstairs in the front bedroom, in the 4-poster her mother had given her at her marriage, and she grew, day by day, thinner and greyer, and less able to speak in more than a whisper. William slept, from the 8th onward, in a hard chair pulled up to the bedside. He fed her broth from a horn spoon. He held the glass of brandy and water to her lips when she asked for it. He read to her, at her request, from the Psalms. Elizabeth, at the door of the room with a basin, watched him do all of it, and could not tell you, at York, whether he had wept once, and neither can I. The record only tells us what he did with his hands. It does not tell us what was in his face. Mr. Morley came on the 9th. Nunnally did not come again. On the 9th, Mr. Morley sat at the bedside for above an hour, and he took Harriet's hand in his, and he asked her, in a voice pitched below William's hearing at the fire in the parlour below, whether she had any pain now that she had not spoken of, and whether she thought there was anything in the house, or in the drink she was given, that did not agree with her. Harriet, in the account he wrote that night, looked at him for what felt to him a long time. She said no. She said her husband was very good to her. She said she was tired now, and would like to sleep, and she closed her eyes and turned her face to the wall. Whether Mr. Morley believed her, we do not know. What we know is that he came down the stairs and stood in the passage and said to William, in a voice Elizabeth heard from the kitchen door, that his wife was very ill indeed, and that he could not, for all his learning and for all his years, tell him now with any certainty what she would die of. William, in Elizabeth's account, said only that he was in the doctor's hands, and that he would fetch him at any hour of the night if the mistress worsened. She worsened, in the small hours of the morning of the 10th. William did not, that time, fetch Mr. Morley. He sat in the chair by the bed, and he held her wrist, and he watched the fit take her, and he watched it not let go. The candle on the washstand burned down to its last inch. In the coal hole at the back of the house, no rat had died. On the mantel in the parlour below, the folded scrap of paper from Boar Lane sat behind the loose lining of the tea caddy, and knew nothing, and had never known anything. In the front bedroom, at a little after 4 in the morning, Harriet drew a long, shallow breath, and let it out, and did not draw another. William stood up from the chair. He crossed the room in the near dark. He opened the door to the landing. He called down the stairs, in an even voice, to Elizabeth on her truckle bed in the box room off the kitchen, that the mistress was gone. Word went out of the house at dawn. Mr. Morley came, and stood by the bed, and did not sit down. Nunnally came, and stood behind him. A third doctor was sent for from Park Row. The three of them, on the landing, in a conversation Elizabeth heard through the banisters, agreed that they could not, in conscience, sign a certificate of natural death. By the middle of the morning, a constable was on the step of Cardigan Place, and by the afternoon, the news was out along Boar Lane, and in the passage off Boar Lane, a lean-faced man, with hair cropped like the pile on a brush, was standing at his window and watching a boy run past with a printed bill in his hand, and was beginning, at last, to think of William Dove. The trial at York. We have to leave Leeds now. Leave the front bedroom at Cardigan Place, and the constable on the step, and the three doctors talking together on the landing in voices pitched below the banisters. We have to go north with the coach and with the mail, up over the flat green fields between the two towns, into a walled city on the River Ouse where an assize court has stood, in one form or another, for 600 years. It is the 15th of July, in the year 1856. The court is about to open on a case the papers have printed by now in every parish of the West Riding, and half the West Riding, it seems, has come to sit in the gallery and hear it. The courtroom in the castle at York is a high square chamber, panelled to head height in oak that the years have turned nearly black. Above the panels the walls run up plain to a ceiling of white plaster. A gallery of narrow wooden benches wraps three sides of the room at the level of a man's shoulder. On this morning the gallery is full, and the corridor beyond the gallery is full, and outside on the paved yard between the castle and the debtors' prison, a crowd of perhaps 400 people is standing in the rain with pamphlets held over their heads. The judge is Baron Bramwell, sent up on the summer circuit from London. He is 52 years old, of a face the papers had called long and thoughtful, and he sits under the royal arms in a scarlet robe and a full-bottomed wig that reaches nearly to his elbows. To his right, at a lower bench, sit the counsel for the Crown, Mr. Overend, Silk, and Mr. Hardy, his junior, with a stack of papers between them, tied in red tape. To his left, at a bench of the same height, sit the counsel for the prisoner, Mr. Bliss and Mr. Middleton, retained by a fund raised, in part, by William's father, and paid, in the rest, out of a sum Harriet had kept in a strong-box under her mother's bed on Wortley Road. It is one of the crueler details of the case that the money Harriet had saved for her own old age was in the end spent on the defence of the man who had killed her. The prisoner is brought up from the cells at 10. He climbs the wooden stair into the dock at the far end of the room. He is 29 years old, of middling height, with hair the colour of wet straw, and a face the reporters that morning called neither handsome nor cruel, but something between the two. He wears the same brushed black coat in which he had walked to Boar Lane and to Park Square, and he is clean-shaven, and his hands rest on the polished rail of the dock as though he were leaning at the counter of a shop. He does not look up at the gallery. He does not look at his father, Christopher Dove, who has come in with the minister from the meeting-house and taken a bench near the back. He looks, in the account the Leeds Mercury printed the following morning, only at the judge, and his face, while he was looked at, was empty. What was behind the empty face is one of the things we will never know. Two men who sat within a yard of him for 3 days wrote afterward, in the sort of letters that survive by accident, that they had not been able to tell. The Clerk of Arraigns rises. He reads the indictment that William Dove, on divers days in the month of March last, at the parish of Leeds, in the West Riding of the county of York, did feloniously administer to Harriet Dove, his wife, a quantity of the poison called strychnia, and did thereby cause her death. He asks the prisoner how he pleads. William, in a voice the papers said was clear and even and unhurried, says, "Not guilty." The clerk sits down. The trial has begun. I want to move through the witnesses with you as gently as I can, because a full assize record is a heavy thing to sit under, and this one ran over 3 days. Only the shape of it matters now, and the shape is already clear from the 7 chapters we have walked together. Mr. Morley took the stand first. He came up from the front bench in the same coat in which he had knocked at the front door of Cardigan Place, and he took the book he had carried in the pocket of that coat, and he opened it on the ledge of the witness box, and he read from it in the voice of a physician who had known, on the 2nd of March, what he ought to have said aloud, and had not said it. He read the word strychnia. He read the words but from whence. Mr. Overend, at his bench, did not press him on why he had not sent for the police that night. Baron Bramwell, above him, did not press him either. What the doctor had failed to do would live afterwards in his own conscience, and in a note in the medical papers of the following year, and the court in July had other concerns. Dr. Nunneley of Park Row followed him. He was, in his own manner, the most certain of the medical men. He walked the court through the recent French literature on strychnia poisoning by repeated doses. He described the arching of the spine, the locking of the jaw, the clarity of the mind through the fit. He was asked whether he had, on the pavement of Cardigan Place on the 4th of March, in the rain, named the poison to Mr. Morley. He said he had. He was asked whether he had gone from that pavement to the town hall or to a constable. He said he had not. He was asked why. He said in a voice the reporter for the Times of London called grave that he had left the matter in the hands of the physician of longer standing in the house, and that he had, since the 10th of March, thought of little else. He stepped down. He did not look at William. William did not look at him. James Peacock came next, the apprentice from the deal counter at Mr. Morley's surgery on Park Square. He was still only 19. He had, in the 4 months since he had opened the poisons book at last and written the second sale, become a young man his master no longer trusted, and he had that summer been quietly told his articles would not be renewed. He climbed the 2 steps of the witness box in a coat that did not fit him at the shoulders. He opened the daybook he had brought from Park Square. He read out, in a voice pitched too low for the gallery on the first attempt, and too loud for the well on the second, the entries of the 1st and the 3rd of March. Dove, 1 shilling, St. Dove. Cardigan Place, 2 shillings. Strychnine, rats. He was asked whether, on either of those days, he had believed the strychnine was for a rat. He hesitated. He said he had wanted to believe it. Mr. Bliss, for the defence, did not cross-examine him. There was nothing to cross-examine. Come away from the well of the court for a breath, because the next witness was Elizabeth, and I do not want to bring her up onto that oak platform without pausing first at the door. Elizabeth Fisher, the servant from Cardigan Place, was 17 years old on the 16th of July. She had never in her life been to York. She had come up the day before in the 3rd-class carriage of a train, in the company of a woman clerk from the office of Mr. Overend, and she had slept that night in a lodging-house on Micklegate she would never see again, and she had eaten no breakfast. She wore the same grey dress in which she had answered the door at Cardigan Place on the morning of the 10th of March to the first constable, and around her shoulders a shawl her mother had died in. She was called by the clerk in a name she barely recognised as her own, and she climbed the 2 steps and she took the oath in a voice the reporter for the Leeds Intelligencer said the gallery had to lean forward to hear. She told the court what she had seen. She told them about the ring of pale sediment in the glass on the low table on the evening of the 6th of March. She told them about the twist of blue paper William had taken from his coat on the afternoon of the 7th, and had tipped, with his back turned to her, into the drink his wife would sip a quarter of an hour later. She told them about the parlour door shut against her for the first time on the 1st of March, and the master steady at his pen at the writing desk while his wife shook on the sofa above stairs. Mr. Bliss stood up to cross-examine. He asked her, in the voice of a lawyer who had been briefed to shake a servant girl, whether she was quite certain she had seen what she said she had seen, and whether it was not the case that a young woman in a state of grief might imagine such things afterward. Elizabeth, at the rail, looked at him for a long moment before she answered. She said she had not imagined it. She said she had watched it because she had been afraid, and she had been right to be afraid. Mr. Bliss sat down. He did not, in Mr. Overend's later notes, ever quite recover his footing with the jury after that. Henry Harrison, the cunning man from the passage off Boar Lane, was called on the 2nd morning. He came up from the cells, where he had been held on a subpoena for his own safety and for the court's, in a coat someone had lent him, and with his hair cropped like the pile on a brush, and he took the oath in the voice of a man who did not entirely believe in the oath. He was asked whether he had, in the winter of 1855 and the spring of 1856, received the prisoner in a room in a passage off Boar Lane in Leeds, and had taken money from him, and had written for him charms upon paper. He said he had. He was asked whether the prisoner had ever, in that room, spoken of a wish that his wife should die. Harrison paused. He looked at William in the dock for the first time. William, at the rail, looked steadily back. Harrison said, in the end, that the prisoner had spoken of it once, in a manner Harrison had taken at the time to be idle. What passed between the 2 men in that look, no reporter set down, and neither of them ever spoke of it again. Mr. Overend did not press him further. Mr. Bliss, for the defence, did not cross-examine him at all. To have done so would have been to open the door of the passage off Boar Lane wider than either side wished the door to stand. The defence, on the afternoon of the 2nd day and through the morning of the 3rd, was insanity. It was the only defence Mr. Bliss had. He called Christopher Dove, the prisoner's father, from the farm at Osmanthorpe, in a coat that had been mended twice at the cuffs, and Christopher told the court, in a voice the papers said broke twice, of the boy who had set fires in the stackyard at 7, and had held the kitchen cat's tail in the door at 9, and had laughed in the wrong places at his own mother's grieving over a dead lamb. Mr. Bliss called 2 of the farmers who had sent William back, a Mr. Ellis of Barwick in Elmet, and a Mr. Beaumont of Rothwell, and both said, in their own words, that the lad had never seemed to them entirely a lad, and had seemed to them at times not to know that other creatures could feel. Mr. Bliss called the minister at Brunswick Chapel, and the minister said, with what visible reluctance a Methodist minister is permitted, that he had once, in a conversation with the prisoner in his study, felt as though he himself were being examined and had come away shaken. Mr. Bliss called, at the last, a physician of the town who had made a study of what the papers were beginning to call moral insanity, and the physician told the court that in his opinion the prisoner, though able to know the ordinary difference between right and wrong in the abstract, had never in his life been able to feel it, and could not therefore be held to the same account an ordinary man. The physician was cross-examined by Mr. Overend for above an hour. He was asked whether a man who bought poison at a chemist's counter and shut a parlour door behind him and burned no paper he needed to hide was not a man who understood perfectly well what he was doing. He answered that understanding was not the same as feeling. The jury, in the gallery reports, wrote nothing down. They were countrymen for the most part, from the ridings around York, and moral insanity was not a phrase that had reached their fields. Baron Bramwell charged the jury on the afternoon of the 17th. He was, in his charge, careful and fair. He set out the medical evidence, and the evidence of the servant, and the evidence of the poisons book, and he set out the evidence of the defence, and he told the jury that if they were satisfied that the prisoner had known that to give poison to his wife was to do a wrong forbidden by the laws of God and of England, they must convict, whatever they thought of the state of his understanding in other things. The jury withdrew at 10 minutes past 4. They came back into court at 25 minutes past 5. They found the prisoner guilty of the murder of his wife. They added, in the foreman's voice, a recommendation to mercy on the ground of the defective state of the prisoner's mind. Baron Bramwell, in the account the papers printed the next morning, listened to the recommendation without moving his face. He drew from the ledge before him the square of black silk that judges kept for the passing of a capital sentence. He put it upon his wig. He spoke the words. William, at the rail, heard the sentence. He did not, in any account, cry out. He did not, in any account, weep. He turned, once the words were done, to the warder at his elbow, and he said, in a voice the reporter for the Leeds Mercury said was almost polite, that he was ready to go down. The warder took his arm. The stair beneath the dock creaked once under their feet and closed over their heads, and the court above them began the ordinary business of rising. Come away from the courtroom now. Come out into the rain in the paved yard where the crowd is already breaking up, and the pamphlet sellers are already crying the verdict, and the newsboys are already running for the wires to London and to Leeds. There is a lodging-house on Micklegate, where a servant girl of 17 is being led back by a woman clerk, and she is not crying, and she will not, in her own account many years afterward, cry until she reaches Leeds. There is a lean-faced man being escorted through a back door into a covered van, and taken away to a train that will carry him, without fuss, out of this story and back into the passage off Boar Lane, where he will live for another 11 years, and never again keep a room for callers. There is a father from Osmanthorpe, standing under an eave with his hat in his hands, and there is nothing more to say to him. And there is, in a covered cart, going now under an archway of the castle, and out onto the road that runs west to Leeds, a young man in a brushed back coat, with the sentence of the court over him, and 3 weeks between him and the walls of Armley Gaol. The candle burned low. We have to leave York now, leave the paved yard, and the pamphlet sellers, and the covered van moving out under the archway toward the road that runs west. We have to go with him, in that cart, along the flat green miles between the two towns, back to a walled prison on a hill above the River Aire on the western edge of Leeds. It is Armley Gaol. It has stood there, in its new sandstone, for only 9 years. Its walls are still the pale colour of a good biscuit, not yet blackened by the mill smoke that will darken them in the years to come. William Dove is brought in at the North Gate on the evening of the 18th of July, in the year 1856, and the door in the wall closes behind him, and he passes out of the streets of the town that had held him for all of his 29 years. 3 weeks lie between him and the morning we are moving toward. I want to walk them with you slowly, because they are the last part of the record we have, and the record is thinner here than we might wish. The condemned cell at Armley in that year was on the ground floor of the north wing. It was a room of perhaps 12 feet by 8. The walls were of the same pale sandstone as the outer wall of the prison, whitewashed twice a year. There was a plank bed hinged to the wall, a stool, a small deal table, and, at the height of a man's head, a single window of 4 panes set with iron. Through the window, when the light was right, a prisoner could see a strip of the sky above the wall of the exercise yard, and nothing more. 2 warders sat with William in the cell at all hours, in shifts of 8. They played draughts on the deal table when he did not wish to speak. They read the newspaper aloud to him when he did. He was permitted, by the ordinary rule of the prison, a Bible, a hymn book, and a slate. The chaplain came to him every day. His name was Mr. Cordew, and he was a Methodist himself, and he had known William's father Christopher, in a distant way, for a good many years through the connection of the chapels. He was a mild man, in his 60s, with hair the colour of unbleached linen, and hands that shook slightly when he set down his teacup. He sat with William for above an hour each morning through the last 3 weeks of William's life. What passed between the two of them we know only in the outline Mr. Cordew himself set down in a letter to his own minister at the end of the month, a letter that survived in a private collection and was printed, in part, in a small book on the case in the 1890s. Mr. Cordew wrote that the prisoner spoke of his childhood at Osmonthorpe, and of the cart, and of the top field where the wind never quite stopped. He wrote that the prisoner asked after his father, and after his mother, and after his younger sister who had married a joiner at Holton. He wrote that the prisoner did not, in the whole of the 3 weeks, speak Harriet's name aloud his hearing, though he had been asked to speak it, gently, on more than one morning. Mr. Cordew wrote that this had troubled him more than anything else the prisoner did or did not say, and that he had come away from the cell on some evenings with the feeling, hard to put into words for a man of his calling, that there was a door inside the young man that had never been opened in his life, and was not going to be opened now by any key that Mr. Cordew carried in his coat. I want to be careful here. The chaplain's letter is not the whole of what passed. 2 of the warders left short accounts of their own, in the way that warders sometimes did in that century, and their accounts do not entirely agree with his. One warder wrote that the prisoner had wept once, in the small hours of a morning in the last week, and had asked whether it was true that a person who had done what he had done would be known again by anyone in the next world. The other warder wrote that in his shifts the prisoner had been calm and even mild, and had spoken of the weather and of the food, and of the pattern of the ivy that grew on the far wall of the exercise yard, and of nothing else at all. Both of these things may be true. A man in a condemned cell is not a single fixed person across 3 weeks. The record only holds what someone thought to write down, and much of what passed in that room passed unwritten. His father came once. Christopher Dove walked up the hill from the town on a Sunday afternoon in the 2nd week of the 3, in the coat that had been mended twice at the cuffs, and he was let in through the north gate, and he sat with his son for the hour the rule allowed. Mr. Cordew, who was in the cell with them, wrote afterward that the father did most of the speaking, and that he spoke of the farm and of a cow that had calved that spring, and of the price of oats at the corn exchange, and of a hymn that had been sung in the meeting-house on the Sunday morning of that week. He wrote that William listened, and answered in short, even sentences, and did not weep, and did not, at the end of the hour, embrace his father. The 2 men shook hands at the door of the cell. Christopher Dove walked out into the yard, and out through the gate, and back down the hill into the town, and he did not, so far as any record shows, come back to Armley again. His son had 5 days left. Come away from the cell for a moment, because while William sits at the deal table with the chaplain, or lies on the plank bed in the small hours listening for the bell of St. Bartholomew's over the wall, the town below him is not still. The town, in those 3 weeks of high summer, is full of the case. The Leeds Mercury and the Leeds Intelligencer and the Times of London print daily notices of what is said to be passing at Armley. Ballad sheets are sold on the corner of Brigate for a farthing apiece. A small book called The Awful Life and Confession of William Dove is printed by a jobbing press on Kirkgate and sold at the doors of the meeting houses on Sunday mornings, though it contained no confession the prisoner had ever made. A petition to the Home Secretary in London, praying that the recommendation of the jury be honoured and the sentence commuted to transportation, was got up by a solicitor on Park Row, and it gathered, in 10 days, above 900 signatures. It included the names of 2 ministers, 3 doctors, and a good many wives of mill managers. It was answered from the Home Office in a printed form on the 30th of July. The petition had failed. The sentence would stand. The news reached Armley by the second post on the evening of the 30th. Mr. Cordew was with the prisoner when a warder brought in the folded paper. He wrote in his letter that the prisoner read the paper through once, and then a second time, and set it down on the deal table, and said only, in a voice the chaplain said had not changed, that he had not expected it to be otherwise, and that he was obliged to the gentlemen who had troubled themselves to sign. He then asked for a cup of tea. Mr. Cordew, who had come prepared to sit with a weeping man, sat instead for another hour with a man who drank a cup of tea in small sips, and spoke of the pattern of the ivy on the far wall of the yard, and, before the chaplain left for the night, asked him whether it would be permitted, on the morning, for him to wear his own black coat, the one he had worn at York, rather than the ordinary shirt of the prison. Mr. Cordew said he would ask the governor. The governor allowed it. William thanked him, when told, in the same even voice. The morning came on the 9th of August. It was a Saturday. The sun rose at a little after 5, into a sky that was clear and cool, with a small mist along the River Aire in the valley below the prison. The bell of St. Bartholomew's rang the hour of 6 over the roof of the north wing. William was already awake. He had slept, by the warder's account, for about 4 hours in the night, and he had eaten, at 6:30, a small breakfast of bread and butter and a cup of tea, and he had asked, before the plate was taken away, for a second cup, and had drunk it standing at the window looking at the strip of sky. He was shaved by a warder. He put on his own brushed black coat. Mr. Cordew came in at 7 with his prayer book open on his hand. The scaffold at Armley in that year stood on the flat roof above the main gate of the prison, and it faced outward, over the wall, so that the drop could be seen from the field on the far side of the road. The field that morning was already full. The papers of the following week gave the number of the crowd as 30,000, though the papers of that century often gave larger numbers than the ground would in truth have held, and a fair account is perhaps somewhere between 15 and 20,000 people. They had come in from the mills at Bramley and Wortley and Kirkstall, in the trains from Bradford and from Halifax, in carts from the villages of the West Riding, and on foot up the hill from the town. They stood in the field from the small hours of the morning, in Sunday clothes and in working ones, and they waited. At a little before 8, the procession moved through the long passage from the condemned cell to the door that opened onto the roof. It was led by the Under-Sheriff of Yorkshire, in his robes with a wand of office in his hand. The governor followed, in a plain dark coat. Then came Mr. Cordew, reading aloud, in the mild Methodist voice, the burial service of the Book of Common Prayer. Then came William, walking between 2 warders, without irons, in his brushed black coat with his hands loose at his sides. Behind him came the hangman. His name was Thomas Askern. He was a shoemaker from Maltby, near Rotherham, who took the work of Yorkshire hangings by the piece. The door onto the roof opened. William stepped out into the morning air. A sound rose from the field, a low sound, less a shout than a long taking in of breath by 15,000 throats at once. He did not, in any account, look at the field. He looked, so a reporter on the wall of a neighbouring building set down that evening, at the sky above the field, and he stood for a moment as though he were listening to something no one else could hear. Askern the hangman set his hand on his shoulder and moved him forward the 2 steps onto the drop. The white hood was drawn down. The rope was placed. Mr. Cordew, at his elbow, said the last words of the prayer. The bell of St. Bartholomew's began to strike 8. On the second stroke, the bolt was drawn. William Dove dropped through the trap and out of the sight of the field, and the field did not for a moment make any sound at all. Then the sound came again, one long sound, and then a slow breaking up into small ones, and the crowd began, without any order given, to disperse. Some knelt in the grass where they had stood, some walked away without speaking, some began the walk down the hill toward the town before the body had been cut down. He was, by the rule of the prison, buried within the walls, in the plot kept for the purpose in the corner of the yard nearest the north wall. There was no headstone. There was, in the book of the prison, an entry made in the copperplate hand of a clerk, giving his name and his age and the date and the cause of death by the hand of the law. That entry is all that survives, in the paper of the prison itself, of William Dove. The grave in the corner of the yard was, in the rebuilding of Armley in the 1960s, moved with the others to a common ground outside the wall, and it is now under a strip of grass beside a car park at the back of the prison chapel, and I have stood there, and it is very ordinary. Leeds went back to its work. On the Monday morning, the 10th of August, the looms at the mills on Meadow Lane and Marshall Street began again at 6, as they had begun on every Monday morning of that year. The chapels held their ordinary services on the following Sunday. The Leeds Mercury of the 15th of August carried the ordinary shipping intelligence and a report of a lecture on the temperance question at the music hall, and only a small paragraph, on the 3rd page, on the disposal of the effects of the late William Dove. The house on Cardigan Place was let, within a month, to a clerk in a wool warehouse and his new wife, who had not heard the story, or had heard it and had not been able to afford to be particular about a house at that rent. The piano Harriet had brought from her mother's on Wortley Road went to her sister and stood in a parlour there for above 30 years and was played on Sunday afternoons. Elizabeth Fisher, the servant, went back to service. She took a place with a family in Headingley and stayed there for 11 years and was married in 1867 at the age of 28 to a joiner from Meanwood, and she had 4 children, and she lived to be 71, and she is buried in the churchyard at St. Chad's under a small headstone the joiner made himself. She did not, in any account we have, ever speak of Cardigan Place in her own house. Henry Harrison, the cunning man from the passage off Boar Lane, was not tried. There was no charge in English law in that year that would fit what he had done, and Mr. Overend, in his notes, had thought it wiser not to try to invent one. Harrison went back to his room. The passage off Boar Lane was pulled down in the widening of the street in 1868, and Harrison, by then an old man, moved to a lodging in Hunslet, and he died there in the winter of 1869, of a bronchitis that carried off many in that year, and he was buried at the parish expense. No one knows now, and perhaps no one knew then, whether he had ever believed a single word of what he had told a customer at the little pine table in the room off the passage. Mr. Morley, the physician, kept his practice on Park Square for another 11 years, and retired in 1867 to a house in Ilkley, and lived quietly there until his death in 1874. Whether he ever, in the 16,000 and more evenings between the 10th of March and the morning of his own death, opened the book he had carried in his coat, and read again the word he had written on that Sunday night, we cannot say. Dr. Nunneley of Park Row wrote a short paper on the case for a medical journal in 1857, which is careful and clear and does not mention the pavement in the rain. James Peacock, the apprentice, did not finish his articles. He went to Manchester in the autumn of 1856 and worked there for a chemist on Deansgate, and married, and passed the rest of his life quietly, and rarely, in his old age, spoke of Leeds at all. Christopher Dove sold the farm at Osmondthorpe in the autumn of 1857. He moved with his wife into a small cottage at Holton, near their daughter, and he died there in the spring of 1860. The stone in the burial ground at the meeting house gives his name and the dates, and no more. His wife lived on until 1868. She was buried beside him. Neither stone speaks of the son. That is what the record holds. It is not everything. It is never everything. Somewhere in the paper of the case there is a note that William, in the last week at Armley, asked Mr. Cordew whether it was true that the strychnia had caused his wife great pain at the last, and that Mr. Cordew, after a long pause, had answered honestly that it had. We do not know what William said in reply. We know only that he asked. It is one of the 2 or 3 small openings in the door inside him, and we cannot see through it any further than that. The candles in the parlour on Cardigan Place had been carried away long before this. The gaslight in the front bedroom was cold in its bracket. In the field beyond the wall at Umley, the grass had grown back over the places where 15,000 feet had stood, and it was only grass again. In the passage off Boar Lane, a workman with a mallet was already, in that autumn, tapping at the plaster of a wall that would come down within the year. And on the mantel of a parlour in a house in Headingley, where a servant of 18 was setting a cup of tea for her new mistress, a clock struck the hour of 4, and struck it as it had struck it in 1,000 other parlours in the town, and would strike it in 1,000 more. The candle burned low, the chamber fell silent, and history once again turned the page in the dark.